Right, so hello, greetings. Welcome to everyone. This is the third day of our World Intellectual Forum gathering. We've had two excellent, seminars before, last couple of days. And today we're tackling a very important topic to do with really global governance. Who's doing the joined up thinking on the planet to help the situation of the world? Who's thinking up a unified global agenda to save the world? I mean, it's an ambitious title. That was going to be the speech by our dear friend, Dr. Swaminathan, who's the global chair of the World Intellectual Forum. But last night he was taken to hospital with a medical emergency, sadly.
Oh my God.
I'd like to start today with we'll do a little minute silence, send him some healing vibes in hospital, in Hyderabad. And we'll begin with just a minute silence and a Tibetan gong for good healing vibes. Thank you. So let's hope he gets better and comes back to us. But we will proceed anyway, and we have enough speakers today in spite of his absence. So let me introduce our first speaker. You know, I'm Thomas Daffer, and I'm a philosopher and historian and European coordinator of the World Intellectual Forum. It's an honor to chair this meeting. Dr. Swaminathan is supposed to co-chair it, but he's not with us, sadly. So our first speaker is Sam Pitroda, who is, I think, a senior Indian intellectual of much stature. Although he's emigrated, mainly lives in the States now, I believe, but he chaired the Knowledge Commission of the Indian government and is going to be talking to us about the role of hyperconnectivity in redesigning the world. He's someone who's thought a great deal about what's going wrong with the world and how can we get out of this situation? What kind of joined up do we need? So Sam, over to you. Welcome to our forum. You joined us yesterday as well and made some great points. Nice to see you again. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Daffer. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all. Greetings from Chicago. I'm not an intellectual. I'm not a great philosopher. I'm just an engineer who sort of had an opportunity to think about the impact of hyperconnectivity. Just to give you a little bit of my background, since we have never met before. I'm 80-year-old, born and raised in British Raj, in a small little town in India, tribal village in Orissa, and came to America in 1964 to get a PhD in physics. Stayed here, worked here, built businesses here, and then went back to India when Rajiv Gandhi was Prime Minister to work on India's IT and telecom. I did most of the fundamental sort of governmental policy and implementation work in mid-80s on telecom, immunization, literacy, water, cooking oil, milk production. Then came back again to US when Rajiv Gandhi died. Went back again when Dr. Manmohan Singh became Prime Minister to head National Knowledge Commission, Innovation Council, and then again came back when the BJP government came to power. So I've been going back and forth, but living in Chicago for about 58, 60 years. And I believe hyperconnectivity is going to play a very important role in transforming human civilization in the next 30, 40 years to come. For the first time in the human history, we are all connected. What does this connectivity mean to human civilization? And that's the fundamental question I have been asking. This is a different kind of connectivity than telephone, because it brings about a whole lot of other features and functionalities, which essentially democratizes information, decentralizes implementation, and demonetizes services. It is about content, it is about communication, and it is about context. Unfortunately, we use all of these things today to do the same thing we have been doing, little better, little cheaper, little faster. But we haven't learned to do things that we have never done before with hyperconnectivity. Hyperconnectivity is transforming everything around us. The fact that you and I can speak like this at no cost was unthinkable 20 years ago. Hyperconnectivity is transforming our education, health systems, financial systems, marketing, distribution, delivery, retail, manufacturing, services, and ultimately governance. So I've been focused on the role of hyperconnectivity going forward. During COVID crisis, like all of us, I was locked up at home in Chicago for about 2 years, 2.5 years. And I started reviewing my own life and realized that the transistor was born after I was born. And I have been a party to this whole telecom revolution in the US from day one. I did some fundamental work in digital switching in the US in mid-60s. I have hundreds of patents in this area. And I could go deeper and deeper into the role of telecom, IT, AI, robotics, machine learning. And in the process, I realized also that the world was last designed just about the time I was born. That design led by US gave birth to UN, World Bank, IMF, NATO ultimately, WTO, WHO, GDP, GNP, per capita income, and all of that. We follow that design even today. I fundamentally believe that 80 years down the road, this design is obsolete. It doesn't work. And we are trying to fix it. That design was based on democracy, human rights, capitalism, consumption, and military. In the last 80 years, we have not created one new global institution of that order to respond to the new reality. We try to tweak existing institutions by announcing Millennium Development Goals, Sustainable Development Goals, which never get done. Millennium Development Goal didn't get done, so we came up with Sustainable Development Goal. Won't get done. Good idea, but in the existing framework, very difficult to execute. Then the world was bipolar. India was still a colony. China did not matter. And Africa was on nobody's radar. As a result, a handful of Western countries decided how they're going to design the world. Right after that design, the world got decolonized. mainly led by Mahatma Gandhi's movement in India. No one ever thought that the entire world will get decolonized in a short span of 25 years. Then came rise of China. No one thought China will be able to rise the way China has been able to rise. Then came fall of Soviet Union. Without firing a gun, Soviet Union was disintegrated. Berlin Wall fell. Lots and lots of new countries were born with the aspirations of being democratic, capitalist, and then world became unipolar. Everything changed because of 9/11. To me, 9/11 was a response to a unipolar world. If there had been Soviet Union, I believe there will not be 9/11. In the process, technology changed everything, became pervasive. When I came to America in 1964, I had never seen a television. I had never used a telephone in my life. Now, technology is pervasive. Everyone is connected with smartphones and fancy features and functionalities. Technology also brought inequality, where very few people are very rich and lots of people are struggling. Very few people are very busy and lots of people are twiddling their thumb. Finally, 9/11 changed American mindset. Their idea of security and safety changed. And ultimately, COVID-19 put entire world to halt. No one ever thought that small little virus in middle of nowhere will put the whole global economy on grind. To me, hyperconnectivity is one area of the change. And the other area is really what reminds us as to what a small little virus can do. It says we are all interconnected, interwoven, interdependent, interrelated. Doesn't matter what we look like, what religion we follow, virus did not distinguish. It also says that the borders have a different meaning now in a hyperconnected world. So I started analyzing all this and I realized that all the problems that we have been discussing for last couple of days are all very well known to all of us. Global warming, authoritarian governments, capturing of democracy, violation of human rights, concentration of wealth, greed, lies, use of social media to propagate personal agenda, character of the political leaders. When I look at G7 or G9, 19 or G20 meetings, I realize that we are basically discussing marketing issues. Everyone goes to these platforms or even to World Economic Forum to market their personal agenda and do not discuss public agenda like Dr. Defren and others talked about here at this platform. In that kind of a greedy ecosystem, everyone is focused on optimizing power and profits, as opposed to optimizing planet and people. This is a fundamental difference. Everyone looks at only two things. How do I increase my power? How do I increase my profit? And not enough people talk about how do I make this planet better and how do I make sure that the people of this planet benefit from it. What is going on in Ukraine is an example of power equation. What is going on with the markets is an example of profit motives. Bitcoin is an example of that. So a lot of this is going on in the world. And we realize that everyone still is focused on 80-year-old design. UN is there, but UN has no role to play. World Bank and IMF made sense when there was no Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Citibank. Now they have no meaning. But at the same time, we have 180 different currencies. Everyone is manipulating markets. Everyone is shifting money around. And poor people have no stake in it. Today, we spend $2 trillion a year on defense when we know that for $200 billion a year, we can eliminate hunger. So on one hand, the old design has done pretty well in terms of maintaining peace to some extent, rebuilding Europe and Japan after World War, improving longevity, decreasing infant mortality, expanding education, democratizing technology. But at the same time, hunger has not been sorted out. Violence has not been sorted out. We have largest number of people in prison in the US, percentage-wise. An answer to that is militarize police, build more prisons. And somehow I don't get it, that we are constantly focusing on different and wrong solutions. I wish in 40s people had paid attention to Mahatma Gandhi's ideas. I was born and raised as Gandhian. I come from Gujarat. My parents believed in Gandhian values. I was sent to a Gandhian boarding school. And to us, truth, trust, love, inclusion, diversity, respect for other human beings, equality, justice, democracy was all built in. Somehow it was never taught in families. But you pick this up and this becomes the core of your life. You don't need to read a book on it. You don't need to take a course on it. But this is your character. And I find that we have lost that. And everybody is greedy. Every politician lies. Everybody has two sides, public side and private side. And we have created a world which is still very colonial in mindset. What is going on with the economy is really a colonial mindset. What is going on in Africa is a colonial mindset, where minerals are taken out, but Africans are still very poor. I know of examples in India where all the big miners have multi-million-dollar homes in London, and people who work at mines are still very poor. I think we need to rethink through this design. And that's the question I started asking. In the process, I realized that today there are two designs. One is the American design, which is to continue with the old design, focus on democracy, human rights, capitalism, consumption, and military. Second is the Chinese design, Belt and Road Initiative. We come into your country, we give you lots of loans, we become friends, and we help you build infrastructure. But then at some point in time, we begin to fall short. Both of these designs are based on command and control. What we need is a new design which is based on collaboration, cooperation, communication, and co-creation. And that's where hyperconnectivity comes into play. We need a third vision of the world beside these two, which is more based on networks, which is more based on collaboration. There is enough in this world to do. And today we are at a point we can produce anything, but we wind up producing for the wrong people. We produce only for people who can afford to buy and not for people who need it. So you get a best degree in the university and you go work for Goldman Sachs. So best brains in the world are busy solving problems of the rich who really don't have problems to solve. And as a result, problems of the poor don't get the right kind of talent. And I have gone through this in my own different ways. I went back to India, worked for about a decade to fix telecom, never took a dime of salary, changed my nationality back from US to India, and learned that local talent is as good as anywhere else. So we built digital switching in India from scratch in mid-80s. When the world said it cannot be done, it will require $1 billion. Believe me, we did it for less than 50 million. And what we did then is paying dividends today after 30 years. When I entered India, we had 2 million telephones for 700 million people. Today, we have 1.4 billion phones. India is a country of connected billion. In addition, we produce $180 billion worth of software export every year, year after year. India is recognized as IT talent in the world. Indians are all over the world in IT industry, running Silicon Valley companies and big tech companies. All of that happened because we focused on indigenous development in mid-80s and trained hundreds and hundreds of thousands of young Indians in IT. It didn't happen overnight. People don't realize that today. It took 30 years to build that institutional infrastructure to provide this kind of global talent to the world. So when I reviewed all of this, I finally felt that what we need is a new design which takes democracy to inclusion. I believe in democracy. I believe in human rights. I believe in equality, justice, truth, love, trust. All of these Gandhian values are very fundamental to my life. US democracy is not inclusive. We have Black Lives Matter here. Indian democracy is not inclusive. Now we are trying to build a Hindu nation. It's crazy. We have Dalits, untouchables. We don't treat our minorities well. And all over the world, democracy needs to be inclusive. Now, inclusion is a very broad concept. It means equal rights, respect, dignity, opportunity, education, access. How do we make our democracies inclusive? We do not have a global institution on inclusion. 2, human rights are not good enough. We need human needs. We live in an economy of surplus. We do not live anymore in an economy of scarcity. We can produce anything. We can feed 10 billion people if we want. But we do not focus on eliminating hunger. World Bank talked 50 years ago about eliminating hunger in 10 years. Hasn't happened because nobody focused on it. It's the best lip service you want to provide. Now, there are different ways to deliver products and services to people. Third, capitalism is not good enough because it has really concentrated wealth. We need new economy. We need bottom-up development. We need decentralized architecture to scale. We need to focus on local talent, local capabilities. The tomato that I eat in the US travels 1,400 miles before it gets to my table. Don't make sense, but we do it.
Yeah.
Third and fourth, that's a third. Fourth is we cannot focus on consumption. We got to focus on conservation and sustainability. Finally, military is not the answer. We must focus on non-violence. What it means is these 5 parameters must change, and we need to build new institutions. Existing global institutions need to be redone, restructured, revised, repurposed. New institutions have to be built. Like yesterday, there was a conversation on global currency. I believe there is a need for that. Global constitution, of course, there is a need for it. And that's what attracted me to come to World Intellectual Forum.
Sam, can I just interrupt, Sam? Sorry about that.
I'm done.
Well, I've got a slight problem here because your half hour is up.
I'm done.
We don't have time for questions yet because we want to go straight on to the next speaker.
Thank you.
Robert.
Thank you.
He's only got a few minutes before he has to get a flight. So what I'm going to do is postpone the discussion of your very important paper, Sam. And thank you for that.
Thank you.
You set the tone for today brilliantly, and we'll come back to these points, okay?
Thank you
Now,
for the opportunity.
Robert Kesten to have the floor, and I hope you can speak and get the gist of your paper across before you have to get to the airport. Robert, welcome. Robert is a human rights educator of much experience and a member of the board of the World Intellectual Forum. Floor is yours.
I consider myself more of an advocate than an educator. I do agree with Sam on many of the things that he said. I disagree on some. I believe that technology is controlled by a handful of corporations and governments that are dictating the terms of how it's used. And the worst offense against the human population is ignorance. On December 10th, 2023, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights will be 75. It is probably the best kept secret on the planet. The vast majority of people don't know there's a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And of those who do, the vast majority have never read it. The most basic element of the Declaration is belonging. Whether you want to call that inclusion or whatever you want to call it, it basically comes down to the same thing. And if you follow the 30 articles, you get it. Not too many years ago, I was talking with Colin Powell's former chief of staff, who was his chief of staff both at the Department of Defense and when he was Secretary of State. He had not ever read the Universal Declaration. When we went over it, he said, I see one problem, and that is it would cost so little to implement that no government would agree to it because it would reduce the amount of money paid to the arms industry, the policing industry, and those other industries that make billions and trillions of dollars off of government funding in order to repress. That is a huge part of our problem, is ignorance. If the people do not know what their rights are, if they do not know what their inalienable rights are, they do not have them. When you do not have them, that means that government takes them. When government takes them, government is extraordinarily reluctant to give them back or allow you to even know that you once had them. So it's not so much, in my opinion, that capitalism is a problem or democracy is a problem or the military is a problem. Those are things that could be overcome by a well-educated, well-informed, engaged population. But when the public is ignorant, of their role, when the public is ignorant of its power, we fall into the clutches of those who know nothing but greed and nothing but the desire for power, which right now is being as well demonstrated around the world as it's ever been over the course of human history. In the United States, you have fights between the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, and the former president of the United States, Donald Trump. Both are not fighting for the people. Neither are fighting to preserve democracy. Both are fighting for wealth and power. You've got Putin. Putin is certainly not fighting for democracy. He's fighting against democracy. China, fighting against democracy and already telling the world, stay out of our way as we go for Taiwan. That's just a small example of everything that's going on. Africa, Brazil, the Philippines, India, Turkey or Turkiye are just some of the examples of the disasters that face us going forward. In our human rights work, which is bringing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to all 7+ billion people on the planet so that they know them and can claim them as their own, we've come to the conclusion that the forces against change are so pervasive that our real job is to prepare the world for after the fall. There is probably no way to stop the trajectory that we're on right now. Between the climate, economics, warfare, failing governments, a failing global economy for the masses anyway, there's very little that any one philosophy or plan can do, because that snowball is going at full speed down the mountainside. The one thing that we can do potentially is prepare people to come out of this disaster with the tools that they need to form a different kind of world. And if we do that, at least the future generations will have a shot at a much better, more productive, more welcoming and belonging world. What we have left the generations coming immediately after us is nothing short of disastrous. We have not paid attention to the lessons of history. We have never learned the lessons of history. There are those who say that history repeats itself. That is a lie. History just keeps doing the same thing over and over again until we learn the lesson and stop it. It's not repeating, it just keeps going. And for every bit of progress we make, we take a step or two back. So the last time I was in India, I followed a group of speakers and they talked about the tragedies of the world. And I said, since I was speaking last, I'm not going to repeat what they're saying. And so I got up and I said, I hate to say that these people were wrong, but in reality, I got to India because there was airfare. There was airplanes. There are women in the audience. 50 years ago, there would have been no women. Many of the people in the room are alive because of advances in medicine. At that time, there was a Black president in the United States, in a land that was known for racism and prejudice. So progress is always being made. It's just progress out of context is not necessarily progress. Great example. Right now in the US, they're holding the January 6th hearings. For those of you who know what that is, you understand the significance in potentially at least delaying the end of democracy in the United States. But in reality, we have to look at that in multiple ways. One, if we get rid of Donald Trump as a viable candidate for 2024, what fills that void? Donald Trump doesn't have any priorities. Donald Trump doesn't care about policy. So although he's dangerous and although he's greedy and although he's selfish, it's manageable potentially. Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, who is quickly picking up the extremists that are leaving the Trump campaign, is not any of those things. He is power hungry and doesn't cotton well to anyone who stands in his way. Potentially far more dangerous than Donald Trump. So the Democrats and the more liberal and progressive population is working diligently to punish Donald Trump, opening the doorway to someone who could be potentially far worse. That means that those who are loyal to Donald Trump will hate the Democrats. They will not hate the people on their own side who have worked diligently to replace him. It is a perfect storm. I will make my enemy the enemy of those whose support I need without taking the wrath of being responsible for the deed, even though I may very well be responsible for the deed. We see this happening globally. The United States is but a microcosm of what's happening politically in so many places. Bolsonaro is no better. Putin is no better. Xi is no better. They are all playing one side off the other, letting their enemies fight their battles for them by confusing the issues. The one thing that is missing consistently is people's knowledge of the rights that they have that are considered theirs, not by the gift of government, not by the gift of man, but inalienable rights. Inalienable is such a powerful word. And the idea of human rights is simply to belong in community with others. What are the tools that we need to live in complex societies, even with those we vehemently disagree with? And there it is in 30 simple articles, with the last article basically saying that nothing you do has the right to usurp the human rights of somebody else. So it tells you right there that your rights end immediately where someone else's rights begin. You have no right to harm someone else, to infringe on someone else's rights. That's where your rights end. That makes it ever so clear in how we have to move forward. That goes along with Sam. But determining whether it's democracy that doesn't work or the military that doesn't work, what doesn't work is that people are not taking their responsibility as citizens. We can change all the parameters we want, but if people will not accept the responsibility that comes along with global citizenship, none of it will matter, because at every void, at every space, someone else will take what's left on the table. And then they will use that to their advantage, unmercifully, to gain more power. And slowly but surely, take whatever rights are on the table. Human rights are who we are, who we need to be. They are the cornerstone of a functioning society, a functioning culture, a functioning world. And it is no small wonder that for 75 years, or the bulk of those 75 years, once the Universal Declaration was codified, it has been secreted. In 1994, the UN voted unanimously for the UN Decade on Human Rights Education. I'm proud to say that that was my idea. Over those 10 years, 1995 to 2004, we learned just how little the world knew about human rights. We learned very clearly how many governments opposed any information on human rights. Every country was asked to send in a report. A few did. Almost no major country, meaning large, meaning wealthy, submitted anything. It wasn't important to them. They didn't want to acknowledge it. And they certainly didn't want their people to know that they had inalienable rights. That includes the United States and France and Britain and Germany and almost every other Western country, as well as those in other parts of the world. When your government is opposed to you being a good citizen, the future is very dim. Is there a potential to change things? I certainly hope so. But the only way we do that is to encourage people, 7 billion people, to take responsibility for who they are, where they live, and remind themselves that they are not electing in democracies leaders. They are electing representatives. If we stop thinking of people in government as leaders, but as representatives of the people who are expected to carry out our desires, our plans, our goals, rather than their own, it changes dramatically the underpinnings of what government is. If we change the underpinnings of government, we have the potential to create a world in our own image rather than the image of the wealthy and the powerful and the corporations that govern the world today. Right now, because people are too afraid to stand up, too afraid to be heard, we dig ourselves into a deeper and deeper hole. Businesses and governments are smart enough to know that as long as they are responsible for the cash that flows into the coffers of all these entities, nonprofits, governmental agencies, and the like, that no one will stand up to them. We see it time and time again. And so since I have limited time, and if there are people who want to say something, I'd like to hear it. I'm going to close now.
Robert, thank you very much for an impassioned talk as ever. You've put human rights education very much on the agenda. Does anyone have any questions for Robert before he has to leave for the airport? Any
I
comments?
think it's great. This is Sam. I think we need to connect. We need to learn a little more from Robert. And I think he's right on the dot. This is the fundamental issue. I agree, and I never saw it the way he sort of represented. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Where are you, Robert? Are you in the US?
Yes.
Okay. We should connect.
Yeah, I mean, you're both on the board of the World Intellectual Forum.
Yeah, I would love to connect with Robert. Thank you.
We have a business meeting tomorrow, so I hope all
Great.
board members will turn up, and we can have discussions more about where we go next. You know.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, I can't be there because I will be continuing traveling, but know that my heart and soul is with you on that meeting, and I would love to see what is discussed.
Okay, and you can listen to these recordings. Anyone else got a question for Robert? Gevorg, you wanted to raise something about human rights, didn't you? In the
I have a question.
Dr. Mishra, go for it.
Yes. So I have a question to Robert. In the present scenario of the world, we have got autocratic system of management of the government and democratic system of the government. In your opinion, and both the systems are accepted, whole globe accepts both these, although they are 180 degrees apart in terms of human rights. What do you think we should do to make a better world, to make people feel that yes, there is something like equality, something like humanity, something like caring for poverty? What do you think? What is the solution in the world?
I mean, the solution is unfortunately very simple, and that's why governments oppose it. And that is to get the Universal Declaration. We have a short form, which is just one page of the Declaration, getting that in the hands of as many billions of people as possible so that they know it and that they can organize around it and institutionalize it in their homes, in their communities. Just like Sam said, it is very important that those things become part of your DNA. It's not something that you should be thinking about. A course on human rights is a waste of time. Living human rights is what makes the difference. How do I not even have to think about it in the course of a day, so that I treat people with that kind of deference, that I treat others the way I would like to be treated myself? That has to become who we are. That takes time. But if you read the Declaration regularly in public, if you make that a family institution, so whatever your holiday is, add the reading of the 30 articles. Make sure your children and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren know what they are, so that they become a part of who they are. Included in your place of work, included in your religious studies, included in all of the other aspects of your life, until it is who we are. It's unfortunate that it takes time, but it is very, very simple. It's like if you're a Muslim, from the day you are old enough to speak, you start learning Islamic prayers. Those prayers become just about who you are. You can recite them from memory because you do it all the time. The difference is that a 2-year-old or a 5-year-old that says those prayers and a 20-year-old understands the words differently. So it is also about lifelong learning. When I say, and I'll just read Article 1, all human beings are born free and equal. To a 2-year-old, to a 5-year-old, to a 7-year-old, excuse me, those words means one thing. To a 30-year-old, those words mean something else because of life experience. So it is a constantly evolving understanding of what human rights are. And that constant evolution is what makes our world a better place, potentially. But when we stop that learning, or we don't allow that learning to ever begin, we create the foundations for a world that none of us really want to live in.
Robert, I've had a request from someone in the audience. Could you put your website into the chat before you go, so people know how to look up your work? And also, we'd love a copy of the one-page declaration.
Very good.
Put your email in as well. And, I think everyone here would like to get involved with this.
Absolutely.
One comment for you, which follows on from what Sam was saying before you go. As an etymological philosopher of language, I want to point out the word rights in English is related to the Sanskrit word rita. Rita is really essential to living in harmony with the cosmic dharma in the thought of Gandhi. That's why Gandhi was so good at this, because he had embodied Rita in his consciousness.
Yep.
Rita is living in sympathetic resonance with all beings, if you want. And so I wonder if somehow in the West we've legalized the concept of rights. We've made it a sort of thing that lawyers do for us when we're in trouble, instead of an internal state of consciousness. So I love what you're saying.
Absolutely.
We have to embody rights, and that, I would say, is getting back to this concept of Rita. Have you looked at the concept of Rita, Robert,
Yes, and we completely disagree that human rights have any bearings in law. They have everything to do with society. They are above the law in the sense that they are not man-given. Laws are given by men or women and government, and human rights are given by nature, or if you believe, they're given by God. But they are not something that should be able to be taken away, and they are not something that are rewarded or awarded. They are something that you're born with simply because you're a human being. And unless we look at them as invaluable and that they are ours no matter what, we will always have this problem of rights. And very quickly, a journalist from Turkey was at a UN conference, and she said, we have a real big problem in Turkey, and that is that when Ataturk took over, he said, all women are now equal, you will have all your full human rights. And then in the current administration, we are told that since government gave them, government can take them away because women never claimed them as their own. And that became a problem and is a problem. And we can see that being a problem all over. Afghanistan is another example. government was changed by war, and all of a sudden women were in school and they were allowed to work and they didn't have to cover themselves, but it was a gift. It wasn't something that women went out and said, this is ours and you can't have it. And so therefore the problems remained and are maintained. And now the regression is ever so clear and ever so obvious, because once again, they didn't belong to the people, they belong to the gifter. And we cannot look at this as a gift. We cannot look at this as a prize. We have to look at this as naturally ours.
Excellent point, Robert. Final question from Gevorg. He is joining us from Armenia, and he's a member of the World Intellectual Forum. Gevorg.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert, for your presentation. I saw in the chat that you are from the PDHRE organization, which I know, and I remember that I met your organization's founder, lady. I'm sorry, I forgot her name, but I know that your organization was the initiator of the human rights education decades that UN announced and several times provided, and many useful projects were implemented. So I'm glad that we met here. Our NGO also have implemented during 2 decades, 20 years, many projects on human rights education. Of course, this is human rights awareness is very, very important. But during these projects implementation, we understood that it is so important to talk about human obligations as well, because we have been teaching people about many times about only human rights. You have these rights, you are equal, etc., forgetting about obligations. And this is, and now currently when we provide seminars or human rights courses, we give much importance about obligation, because many individuals today know their rights, but they forget their obligation against towards other individuals, towards their parents, and in society. This is very important, I think.
Thank you.
And that's why I said that utilizing the declaration to understand what good citizenship is. Good citizenship is that responsibility. Good citizenship is how we treat others. It is how we work with our communities. It's how we work within our families. It's our responsibility to vote, to run for office, to hold our elected officials accountable, to understand that they are representatives, not leaders, all of those things. So you're absolutely right that you do not have human rights unless you respect all the elements, and a big portion of that is knowing what your responsibilities are to make it work. So I agree 100%. I just think that it has to be a part of everything, not a course, but integrated into all aspects of our lives. And with that, I have to go, but thank you so much, Thomas. Thank you all. And
No,
I look
thanks for
forward
being-
to hearing from anybody who is interested. Thank you.
Okay, bless you. Have a good flight.
Thank you. Multiple.
Ian, you had a question. Would you like to follow on? You'll have to unmute. He'll be able to listen to your comments later when he watches.
Right, okay. Well, Robert, the last three speakers have all honed in on the very basic thing which I've been writing about for years, the concept of covenant, which involves obligations and responsibilities and responses. And I said yesterday in my email that I was going to take my paper off the table. I'm not. Having heard those three people, there is so much of importance, absolute importance, that I'm going to put it back on the table and hope to make that a focus of the times in front of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Yeah, that's great. We can go into it all in the business meeting. We can discuss where we take these ideas. Ian has a very interesting research project to do with analyzing, let's call it the religious aspect of human rights and covenant. Can we get agreement between the different religious streams, everyone from the pagans, the primal indigenous religions, through the covenant religions, Abraham, Islam, Judaism, and so on, right up to even new religious movements. I mean, spirituality is still around and bubbling away. So that will be exciting. We'll discuss it when we come to our business meeting, which is tomorrow and the next day. Thank you very much. And now we come on to our friend Marko Hren, who is joining us from Slovenia, who is going to present a talk on the dynamic view of multilateral governance. Marko Hren is himself a Slovenian peace activist for many years. He was involved back in the days of the Yugoslav attempt to, I suppose, take away human rights in Slovenia, and has been an outspoken activist on peace for many, many decades. He was involved with the Helsinki Citizens Assembly in Prague in 1990, which I also attended, and has been working for the government on issues to do with hyperconnectivity, Sam, so even in your field, and is a member of the board of the World Intellectual Forum, and is also an activist with the Indigenous peoples of Slovenia, an organization called Upasana, which looks at the ancient natural faith traditions of the Slavic world. So it has many things to say, I'm sure. Do share your views on multilateral governance with us, Marko. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Thomas. I wanted to demonstrate hyperconnectivity. I am on my way from my office on my bike, and I stopped here by the river using hyperconnectivity. Do you hear me well?
Yeah, we can hear you fine. Yeah.
I'm absolutely thrilled to speak after Sam and Robert. Sam, we are both IT experts. I was building the first telecom systems, digital telecom systems here locally. So I have been through information society revolution from its scratch, from its beginning. And at the beginning, I would like to link Robert's and Sam's contributions in one thought, Thomas. Namely, the hyperconnectivity and information society has both excellent advantages, as shown by Sam, and I agree as IT professional, and it has a very strong potential to bring more generations to come to more ignorance. Robert spoke about ignorance as main cause for injustice, and I agree with Robert completely. And I see that artificial intelligence and other information society technologies has both potentials to lead people towards more ignorance and to lead people to more in substance connectivity, to more solidarity, so to say. Well, now back to my mission here. My mission is to speak, to contribute to our debates on new governance systems. And what I was going to suggest is a dynamic approach as opposed to static approach to evolution of governance systems. I was going to propose that we work in parallel on three processes. The reason why I'm intervening with this paper is that I hear so often that existing governance systems are failing to approach big crises like Ukraine and in terms of peace building and climate change in terms of environment. Of course, it is true in a static view, but if we take a dynamic view on the developments, we will see another picture. What I was going to suggest is that we work parallel on three tracks: short term on strengthening democracies and human rights, as Robert explained, and I do not need to go into details. Strengthen local democracies, regional governance systems for short-term reasons. Second track to contribute to reform of UN wherever we feel it's necessary. For example, the question of veto and stuff like that. Democratizing existing structures. And third, to further develop our thinking on long-term future governance systems. Since there is no shortcut, there is no quick solution to an effective and efficient governance system, it makes no sense to debate a vision of future democratic participatory governing systems whenever we deal with contemporary problems like Ukraine. Long-term visions concerning governance systems can contribute nothing to contemporary crisis, and we all agree. Huh? So for the purpose of rethinking multilateral governance, I wanted to speak of the short insight into history of multilateralism. All multilateral debates were around peace, and we need to look into the evolution of understanding of peace concepts, at least shortly. Until 19th century, the understanding of peace was the absence of war, and all conceptualizations of multilateral debates were around that. The peace depended on enlightened kings and military leaders. So we know that I often recall, and I thank Robert for bringing the issue of colonization into our debate. In the late 19th century, 1881, we had Berlin Conference, which was about debate on absence of conflicts in colonized countries. The debate in Europe was amongst colonial nations and rules of the game in colonized countries. So that's where we were 150 years ago. In 19th century and then in 20th century, we began to debate the notion that came into our awareness only 50 years ago, that peace and human rights are indivisible. It did not begin with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but only afterwards with the fall of Berlin Wall. So we are only 50 years after the revolutionaries thinking of peace, bringing human rights into debate of peace. Thomas, you remember Helsinki Citizens Assembly? It was based on the slogan, peace and human rights are indivisible. So we cannot speak of new world governance system without having human rights implemented globally everywhere. It wouldn't work. But that was the message of 80s of the previous century. Then we were moving towards the interdependence of peace and social cohesion. Whatever we do in Europe now is social cohesion. The European policy is built around social cohesion. The solidarity, the cohesion funding, the budget of European Union is based on cohesion of regions. In this respect, I would like to complement what Sam said in his introduction. We have currently a third development concept, the design. It was introduced by Japan a decade ago, and this design is titled Society 5.0. It takes hyperconnectivity fully into account. It takes the awakened citizen fully into account. It takes the responsibility of citizens fully into account, and it takes the edge technologies fully into account. So we are now practically discussing the new understanding of peace, which is peace with everything, peace with nature, peace with environment, peace cross species, a giant concept of peace, peace across species solidarity, cross species peace. This is something which is in the air now and which was promoted only for 40 years with deep ecology thinking, with the beginning of the debate on sustainable development, peace with all species, with biodiversity. This concept is only in discussion in Europe and in the Western part of the world. I'm not speaking about giant concept of cross-species solidarity here. But globally, it's only debated for 40 years. And here comes in the dynamic perspective. I was a part of NGOs in sustainable development and peace and human rights. We were campaigning for the understanding of sustainable development 30, 40 years ago. And I must say that UN has brought this issue relatively quickly on its agenda. In '92, I was a part of Commission of Sustainable Development very early after I entered the government in 2000. In 2002, I was a part of Slovene delegation, European delegation at Commission of Sustainable Development during Slovene presidency over European Council in 2008. And I spoke to General Assembly. The development of sustainable development thinking was in dynamic view rapid. In a couple of decades, everyone is discussing sustainable development principles. I just participated at one conference of small and medium enterprises last week as a government representative of Slovenia. There were dozens of SME leaders and owners, young entrepreneurs, and they have sustainability thinking built into their designing of new products and services. So the concept is entering the business world with the speed of light if we think it in dynamic terms. Of course, if we think in static terms, then we conclude that UN is not, and regional governance systems are not approaching climate crisis quick enough. It's all true, but in dynamic view, if I look into what was in debate 30, 40 years ago and how enterprises did not want to hear about sustainability principles, then we have enormous development. In Europe, we are on the edge of standardizing all products and services in terms of life cycle assessment on sustainability. Many products already have their fact sheets and mathematical methods designed to standardize all production. This would result in non-importing any products that would not meet sustainability criteria in life cycle. This is what I do in my professional work in the government. So we are getting our industries ready to cope with new standardization. Last year, European Union adopted a taxonomy regulation, which is paving ground to standardization. This will revolutionize the production, and our enterprises are getting ready for it. I will only mention one more example of rapidly speed reaction of UN bodies. For example, during the recognition of Slovenia in a couple of decades ago, UN recognized Slovenia 1 year after the war in Slovenia. This is, in terms of the procedures of global governance, light speed. UN reacted with light speed to the aggression of Russia in Ukraine last year. In spring 21, a declaration was adopted. These are quick motions. The current sanctions were imposed on large scale with the light speed. These are enormous development in terms of governance. With these examples, I want to answer to all those who criticize existing governance systems and want to leapfrog the governing systems with ideas of future governance systems that we envisage and that Robert spoke so eloquently about. So I think that there is no leapfrogging possible because of the argument that Robert brought into discussion, and it is that the responsibility of citizens and the full implementation of human rights shall be overall implemented as hyperconnectivity is currently. So this is basically how I would approach with the World Intellectual Forum the issue of governance systems. We will need to build on national government systems, regional governance systems as European governance systems is evolving very quickly and rapidly. As you know, European Union is enlarging constantly with new members. The Constitution of European Union is being adopted, amended regularly. The rules of the game within European Union are being amended regularly, and the same applies to other regions. For example, we are not taking into account the evolution of African Union and regional governance systems. It would be very good to have one dedicated discussion on evolution of African Union and the experience we can take from there. But my message to the forum and to the debates on governance systems is that any efficient and effective governance system in future will have to be built on local democracies and regional partnerships. Otherwise, it would not work. So I would like to leave space for discussion here, because Sam and Robert and I were very compatible. I enjoyed this session, Thomas, very much. So I think that debate can be around all three contributions. Huh?
Well, thank you very much, Marko. That was a good summary of your position.
Thank you.
I don't think I heard the talk by Professor Glenn Martin on his his global constitution yesterday. We did also hear from an African philosopher, George Mutalemwa, who spoke about the metaphysics of global governance in Africa on the first day. So, you know, Africa is very much on our mind. But thank you for raising the European Union as a sort of intermediary step between dysfunctional nationalist populist governments and sort of regional responsibility and good governance. This is why I was personally so opposed to Brexit, because it seemed to be putting the clock back. Right, any questions to Marko? We have 10 minutes or so for discussion. Then we're going on to hear from Nicholas Hagger, who will be also addressing this question of global governance systems. Any questions to Marko? Put up your electronic hand, or
well, I would add, Thomas.
Yeah.
There is no hand. I do not see any hand up at the moment.
Sure.
Organization on Security and Cooperation in Europe.
Right. Tell us about.
Implemented a monitoring mission in Ukraine in 2014, immediately after the conflict broke out almost 10 years ago. So the monitoring system and the information about conflict in Ukraine is officially available on the website of OSCE for 8 years now. So everyone who, I was disappointed yesterday on Gandhi's statement concerning the provoked aggression. If we look into the data available on the public website of European Observatory of the crisis in Ukraine from 2014, we would see all incidents listed, documented, and to the minute of the appearance of an incident documented. So that's also the value of regional, cross-regional security, peace, and democracy and political governance systems.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I mean, I also found, you know, some of the remarks from Dr. Gandhi on the first day and others not fully informed about the situation in Ukraine. I mean, Russia's done a very good job, if you don't mind me saying, with propaganda. Putin is a master at propaganda. And we now know that Brexit was largely achieved thanks to Russian GRU support, which was sort of used to whip up a sort of Brexit mentality in the British people, as it was to support Trump. And if you don't believe me, read the book by Professor Timothy Snyder of Yale University, The Road to Unfreedom. He documents this in absolute detail and proves it as a historian. And we're fortunate, Marko, I hope you'll be here at 4 o'clock. We're getting a special lecture by Professor Norman Davies, who's you know, one of Britain's leading historians of East Europe. And he's going to be speaking about the Ukraine war in its East European context, because he's opposed this idea that Europe is just Western Europe. No, Norman was a professor at the school I was educated at, the School of Slavonic and East European Studies. And I did my papers in Balkan history, East European history, and I came to really, you know, it's the other part of Europe, right? So, any other points? Sam, do you want to comment on anything Marko said? And then we're going to go on to Nicholas Hagger's paper.
No, I'm in alignment with Marko. I think we are all in agreement, all three of us, but we need to do something. I want to do something, not just talk, which is great.
Well, thinking is also an activity, Sam. As Fichte said, the great German philosopher, thinking is also an activity. That's the slogan of the World Intellectual Forum.
I agree with that, but we got to go beyond that.
Sure.
Okay.
Can I just ask you, Sam, to comment on, somebody made the point, I think it was Robert, who had to go and get a flight. He sort of had a little shoot at your singing the praises of hyperconnectivity as the solution to everything. He pointed out—
I'm not saying connectivity is solution. I'm not saying that connectivity is the solution to everything.
No,
Please.
But he pointed out that the high-tech giants, the super giants, Facebook, you name it, Twitter and all the rest, are actually in the control of very small oligarchical elites. And so
that has to be
we have a
broken,
monopoly of information.
which is true, but that's not only true of technology. It is true of energy. It is true of oil. It is true of lots of things. It is true of banking.
So how do we get
True of
around
lots
that
of
problem?
things.
Does Marko or you have a solution to the economics of this?
Yes, we can talk about that separately. Yes, we have a solution. Absolutely.
Marko, what's your solution to this? I mean, the European Union is standing up to things like Facebook and that.
You got to break them up. You got to break them up. You got to create smaller enterprises. We did same thing to AT&T in the US in 1984.
Exactly. There is a competition on all of those applications. We do not need to use Facebook.
You don't need a global Facebook. You need a local Facebook. I don't need to connect with the world. At least I need to connect with my community, whatever that community is. Okay.
Well, Sam and I understand each other. Internet was designed as decentralized structure.
Exactly. And not centralized.
And it still is a decentralized structure. Even though there are a couple of players that are centralizing the content and also infrastructure. But in principle, the design of internet, the World Web,
Totally
is
decentralized.
So we don't need to use apps that are we could boycott it, but
Exactly.
this depends on what Robert said: responsibility of consumers.
And you don't need global Twitter. You could have local Twitter. Okay. I don't need to know every time what Trump says.
Well, for example, nobody in my environment is using Internet Explorer.
Yeah.
Because it brings you Trump on front.
Okay, I have a question to Marko.
Sure, come on.
Go on,
Thomas, do you permit?
Yeah, Dr. Mishra, do ask. Yeah.
Okay. Marko, in the context of the global government and imagining the kind of system of governance that you talked about, I wonder, in terms of evolution of humans, how do you imagine what has been the trend now for future? How the governance systems will change in future such that there is a greater peace on the earth? What do you think?
I agree with Robert in these terms completely. The responsibility of citizens coupled with human rights. I praise education. I'm a Gandhian as well as Sam is a Gandhian. And to the left of my screen, I see a Gandhian picture and his slogan, be the change you want to see in the world. So I think that education is absolutely key. And within education, spiritual education is key. If we want local governance systems responsible, then we need local people responsible.
No, but the question of nurturing citizenship is a local issue. The government is nurturing citizenship in a particular way in every country.
Exactly.
So how we overcome this situation? We cannot have many citizenships and still we say we are unified humans. It is not possible.
Can I add something? I think what
Please.
Marko is saying basically is that we need more decentralization of governance. We need to focus on smaller enterprises. We need to foster local talent, local capabilities. All governments today are centralized. All government today want command and control. and it is antithesis to hyperconnectivity. Hyperconnectivity basically empowers human beings. How do we empower them? This is not a telephone. This is an instrument to empower me. It is something where I can democratize knowledge.
Right. Can I just give the last word to Marko? We're coming up to the end of this time slot, and we have to hear from Nicholas next. But Marko, would you say that part of the answer to Dr. Mishra's question is decentralizing spiritual knowledge, getting back to local spiritual knowledge? Just tell us in a few words why you've been working with Upasana. What is the local spiritual knowledge you've been trying to work with there?
Well, very simply, we have to reread Dostoevsky, who wrote a novel, Bessie, and he argued that future religion, future spirituality will be local, and he argued that any attempt to universalize religion leads to destruction of nations and local peoples. Why? Very simply, because sustainability rules of each and every habitat, biodiversity system is specific, and we need to establish specific rules for life in specific ecosystems. Each river, I'm sitting by the river, each river has a different ecosystems, and rules of the game in each river are different. And this is why, if you want, spirituality conceptualizations need to be localized, need to be in proximity. When we talk about hyperconnectivity, we speak about proximity, about locality, about regional, local.
Context.
Community, if you want. Local community, local ecosystem, local biodiversity.
Well, there's a huge area of discussion there. I mean, the Shinto people in Japan know that every river, every mountain has its own kami, its own spiritual essence. The Druids in Europe know the same. We honor the local deities, but we also honor the universal energy within them all. Anyway, it's a long topic. Thank you so much, Marko, for your brilliant sharing. Is that the Socha River? What's the river behind you there?
That's a Ljubljana River, Ljubljanica.
Okay, say hello to the river from us.
River, say hello to everyone.
It's doing its dynamic evolving. Yes.
Exactly. It's a dynamic approach.
Thank you. Okay, now we have got the stage set very well for Professor Nicholas Hagger, who's an expert in all the issues we've been talking about. Nicholas is very much a polymath. He fits right into the World Intellectual Forum. He's a poet, a literary scholar. He's written on Shakespeare, on the Renaissance. He's an expert in global governance systems, and he's been doing a lot of deep thinking over many years on how we can save the planet through joined up thinking. So Nicholas, welcome. You belong here. You're going to talk to us on the world state and the world constitution. The floor is yours, sir.
Hello. Yes, I am. And may I first say how much I agreed with so much in the previous three contributions, but I'm not going to be local in what I say. I'm going to be more global, but nevertheless, the local and the spiritual are still very much there. So what I want to do to you, for you today is to give you an overview of how I see a world state. A huge subject to cram into a short time. But first of all, a bit of background to my world state, starting from where I'm coming from. So I'm coming from universalism, which is my philosophy of the fundamental unity of the universe and all humankind. Unitive vision instinctively sees unity behind all differences. And it's what happens to your way of seeing things at the end of a mystic way. So those of you in India will understand what I'm saying about enlightened vision, which brings us back to spirituality. My mystic way lasted 30 years, and is documented and reflected in some of my literary works. My universalist approach is in all my 60 books. They cover 7 disciplines: world mysticism, world literature, world religions, world history, world philosophy, world politics and statecraft, and world culture. All disciplines are connected within the fundamental unity of the universe and humankind, and so it's necessary to be cross-disciplinary and at home in many disciplines, like a Renaissance man, like the Renaissance men. I've universalized all my 7 disciplines as far as they'll go. For example, my historical universalism shows 25 civilizations going through 61 similar and universal stages. For example, my philosophical universalism has taken me to a theory of everything, which is set out in my coming The Algorithm of Creation, out later this year, or certainly early next year. And my political universalism has taken me to a world state. Political universalism is about the fundamental oneness behind the apparent differences in international politics and statecraft, and the fundamental oneness of diverse humankind. Nationalism is about humankind's differences in separate nation states, and it generally leads to war, as we're witnessing in Ukraine. Internationalism is what the UN does to restrain separate nation states. Supranationalism, S-U-P-R-A nationalism, unites all nation states at a supranational level and is the way forward to peace, prosperity, and stability. And the farthest political universalism can go is to a world state. So I started my investigation into a world state with the world government. Look, you can see at the back there, 2010. It's a historical approach to the long yearning for a world government. I show 8 different possible models. There are a number of different approaches to a world government circulating now, maybe perhaps a dozen. And these reflect parts or all of one or other of these models in varying degrees. The 8th model is the one I regard as ideal for the kind of world state called for by, after 1945 and the Hiroshima bomb, by Truman, Einstein, Churchill, Eisenhower, Gandhi, Russell, J.F. Kennedy, and Gorbachev. But this has been going on for 2,000 years, and it features many in the past have called for a world government of some sort, including Plato in his day, in the Republic. I took this model up in World State, which came out in 2018. This sets out the ideal world government as a partly federal, democratic world state. Partly federal because it has just 7 goals. And the 7 goals are keeping peace between nation states and disarmament, sharing resources among and solving energy supply to all humankind, solving environmental problems such as climate change and global warming, ending disease, ending famine, solving the financial crisis, and redistributing wealth to eliminate poverty. My world states, partly federal, all the 193 nation states of the UN would continue as they are internally and with modifications internationally, but they would be under a supranational level that would work on achieving these 7 goals, just these 7 goals. The world state would be called the United Federation of the World, from a line in Tennyson's Locksley Hall in 1842, in the Parliament of Man, the Federation of the World, UF for short, not the UN, but the UF. The word united suggestively incorporates the United States, and the word federation suggestively incorporates the Federation of Russia. I'm sorry about China, they've got a bit left out. The structure in a chart is in a chart in the books, and you're looking basically, without trying to read it, at the highlighted areas, just so you can see, get a total view of the chart of the structure of the world state. So working upwards, at the international level, there would be a directly elected lower house, a World Parliamentary Assembly, initially with 815 seats, and eventually, when dependent and disputed territories can be represented, 850 seats, that's 850. Initially, the World Parliamentary Assembly would be housed in the UN General Assembly a few days a month as it's phased in. The UF in place of the UN. The UN Security Council would become a veto-less World Executive Council. Above that, at the supranational level, there would be a directly elected upper house, a World Senate with 92 senators in 46 zonal seats, that's 2 per zonal seat. A World Commission of 27, which would operate like the European Commission. A World Council of Ministers with 29 world departments, and a world president elected every 4 years. There are 133 pages of detailed evidence and data in the appendices of World State, including the world population figures of the nation states as percentages of the world population, based on the 2016 projections of the UN Development, the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. At the international level of the World Parliamentary Assembly, in other words, the UN General Assembly, I used the criteria in Clarkin zones, that's SOHN, World Peace Through World Law, 1958. And their task was to reform the UN Charter. World State lists their 17 revisions of the UN Charter. So world law reinforces peace. I modified all the data to take account of and adjust for nuclear influence and permanent membership of the UN Security Council. I took account of the populations and territories of all nation states and allocated seats in accordance with size and world influence. I came up, as I've said, with 815 seats for the World Parliamentary Assembly, with single seats to be given in due course to 26 currently dependent territories and 9 disputed territories, eventually making 850 seats. Manageable, not too large, but covering everywhere. Okay, there can be disagreements regarding the detail and number of seats allocated to a particular region, and regarding the differing approaches of a dozen different models that are circulating. But there is unity behind all apparent differences. That is so important, unity behind all apparent differences. And these can be sorted out during a study that needs to be completed by a working party that would be set up by the UN General Assembly to look at all the models for a world state ahead, all dozen of them, into which the UN will eventually pass. I've also written World Constitution, that's this book, in 2018, which presents a world constitution with 145, that's 145 articles in 14 chapters. I've consulted 26 constitutional precedents and 204 constitutions. So I did a lot of research for it and covered all aspects of a world state's rights and freedoms and structure. This is where I come in with what the previous speakers have been saying about rights and freedoms. And I'd like to read you the preamble to the World Constitution that I wrote, because it echoes the 1787 American Constitution and poetically recites the world state's 7 goals. So I'm reading the preamble. We, the assembled peoples of the world, resolved to form a federal union of humankind, inaugurate a universal peace, freedom from war and menacing weapons among all nation states, redistribute Earth's natural resources and energy equitably, protect the environment from pollution and global warming, banish disease and famine, consolidate wealth, prosperity, and financial security, eliminate poverty, advance universal justice and welfare, tolerance, human rights, and social progress for the common good, preserve all civilizations' religious traditions, and found a new epoch of human unity, do ordain this Constitution to establish the United Federation of the world. To me, what the assembled peoples are resolved to do summarizes what the WIF is trying to do in a connected up way, which is one of the reasons I've chosen this theme today. I'd also like to read you the closing words of World State. And so I appeal to the UN. Members of the General Assembly, do your duty. Give up a little sovereignty to the supranational level in respect of the 7 goals, so there can be universal peace and disarmament on a legally enforceable footing. You will still retain your national or regional sovereignty outside the areas of the 7 goals. That's very important. Have courage and be forward-looking. Bring in the universalist world state. The next step might be for me to write to the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, and ask if a working group can be set up to study the various models, that's the dozen models, and approaches to a coming world government through a partly federal world state, and write a full report to the UN General Assembly that can result in a peaceful future. Somebody said earlier, we need to do something. This is what I'm trying to do something now. If necessary, I would be prepared to outline the idea to the representatives of the UN General Assembly, either by Zoom or face-to-face, and then request them to support setting up a working party. This could be a WIF-backed effort. I sent Professor Swaminathan the 3 books I've shown today 2 years ago in July 2020. And this proposal furthers his call last April for help in communicating the need for a world government. A more precise approach may be for me to write to Antonio Guterres and ask if UNODA, that's UNODA, the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs, which oversees working groups on disarmament, could set up a working group to study all the approaches to a world government through a partly federal world state and write a report to the UN General Assembly within a year. UNODA may be a better route than the General Assembly Open Working Group, that's the OWG, on Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, which includes considering global governance. But global governance is about the rules that transcend national boundaries at the international level. And it doesn't go far enough towards a world government through a partly federal world state at the supranational level. So global governance doesn't really get to the supranational level. The UN should give the study I'm proposing its own treatment and working group and not squash it in among sustainable development goals. The best way forward then may be for me to write to Antonio Guterres and ask if there can be a new working group under UNODA, which could be called, and this is possibly a full title, Working Group on the Approaches to and Feasibility of a World Government through a partly federal world state with legal power to disarm. That's really important, with legal power to disarm. A copy of the letter should be sent to the UN Under Secretary General and High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. That's Izumi Nakamitsu of Japan, who is the head of UNODA. So Guterres would get a letter, and she would get a letter as well. The working group would study all the approaches and write a report to the General Assembly within a year. Okay, should the WIF support this initiative? If the answer is yes, and if I were empowered by the WIF to approach Antonio Guterres as the WIF's ambassador to the UN or a similar representational title, I would write to him on the WIF's behalf and send the video of this talk as a starting point. It may be that Thomas, Dr. Daffin, would want to be involved, perhaps in conjunction with Professor Swaminathan. All writers like to keep written records, ultimately, eventually, of their talks for future use. And within a little while, I will be able to send a written text for what I've been saying to accompany the video. So thank you for your attention. We now have a little time for questions, perhaps 10 minutes. And I'd be interested to hear your reaction to my proposed initiative, which, if it happens, will increase the WIF's visibility on the world stage. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Nicholas. That was a brilliant overview, very succinct and very to the point. And congratulations on your books and your lifetime's career as an activist intellectual. You know, I have a first question before other people come in. Did you, I don't think you were there. We heard a lecture from Professor Glenn Martin, who's the president of the World Constitution and Parliament Association. Now, Glenn is also on the board of the World Intellectual Forum, as are you, as is Swaminathan. And it's a thing of great perplexity and sorrow to me that, you know, that you can't all sit together, get in a room and come up with a joint plan. I mean, Glenn Martin's point was that they already have a constitution. He was quite scathing about the UN. I'll be frank, you can listen to his talk once it's posted. He said that the UN is embedded with the concept of national sovereignty. That's like their fixed red line. They'll never shift from that because it's inbuilt into the structure. He also said they're embedded to, well, what follows from that is sovereignty over their natural resources and sovereignty over their military prowess. So this gives people like Putin and the dictators of the world the green card to do what they want. So Glenn was saying, we're not going to be able to get the world governance system we want by asking the UN humbly, please UN, give us a world government, because they're like implicit in the current system. As Sam said, they were set up ages ago to defend that status quo. So my only question to you is, you know, if you and Glenn sat down and with me and Swaminathan and others, and we had a working group within the World Intellectual Forum to think this problem through, my fear is that you can write to the UN all you want, they'll kick it into the long grass, because structurally they're not interested in world governance. Whereas if we go the independent route, which Glenn has been pioneering, and somehow modify his approach with yours, which I think has a lot of mileage. I like what you're proposing, but we have to do it in a way that isn't dependent on the generosity of the UN, because the very structure of its power leverages is implicit in keeping the current system, and their lack of joined upness. So Glenn pointed out that the Sustainable Development Goals don't really deal with peace, for instance, which is absurd. So anyway, have you any contact with Professor Glenn Martin, and could you find a way to work on a general joined up kind of approach, do you think?
So I have been in touch in the past with him, and I've got a copy of the Earth Constitution in my library downstairs, and we both share coming out of the Universal State of the Earth, Igor Kondrushin's world state, which I actually brought in. I chaired the Constitutional Convention. That was coming from philosophy based on classical Greece, where there was very limited democracy, even though it was the old Athens was the birthplace of democracy. And there's a democratic shortfall in the Universal State of the Earth, as everybody realizes, I think. Every model is coming from a different area, which is why I said I was coming from universalism and in many disciplines and trying to connect everything together. And so I've emphasized certain aspects, but I do agree with what Glenn Martin has said about the UN. We're actually saying to the UN, you are going to declare yourself redundant as the world state is phased in. And it makes sense for in the early days for it to meet a day a month and then 2 or 3 days a month in the UN General Assembly. I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist, but the UN was set up by the Rockefellers in 1945, 46. And the Rockefellers are very interested in progressing towards a world government. And it could be that there are powers behind the scenes that would go and have a word with some of them and perhaps, and what I would like to do is to meet Guterres and explain to him that this is really desirable for the world, as Professor Swaminathan said at the beginning of his document in April. There are dreadful things happening in the world, Ukraine being one of them, and only a world government will really cope with it. But we don't want a world government that will be a dictatorship of the world, which is why I'm limiting it to 7 goals. And everybody carries on internally, nationally. But yes, this is why if there are a dozen different versions circulating, all coming from different origins, as it were, we do need to get together and pool, and nobody can have 100%, but everybody can have a little bit of theirs, and it makes it happen. And coming back to the plea to do something earlier, that's what we're trying to do. It's a constructive idea to try and do something. I would gladly work with Glenn Martin. We both, I know Igor was in touch with Martin not long ago, and there's a kind of triangle there. I'd be in touch with Igor as well, and I'd be in touch with, of course, Professor Swaminathan. So that's 4 of the various disciplines which are already in-house. I was thinking of proposing that there should be a WIF working party as a stepping stone to a UN working party that would report to the General Assembly. But if we could fast track it and go straight to the UN one and then report, and everyone individually, and Glenn Martin would spend days with them, I would, and the others, and so inject. And then this could be a report to everybody with pressure from you and so on, and pressure from the WIF. So this would be a kind of WIF initiative that the UN General Assembly would follow. And this would really put the WIF on the international stage, that this was going to go on for a year, and people would know about the WIF if that happened. So this is an idea. Can we do something? Can we turn this action, which can include all the points, the good points that were being made of the previous three speeches, and of course there's room for locality in a partly federal world state. The communities are even more important if that's the structure. So it can all be put together. Behind all apparent differences, there is unity. I learned this in Japan when I was in Japan in the 1960s, and I sat with Professor Nishiwaki. I remember he said to me, Confucius said in algebraic theory, plus A plus minus A equals 0. Every plus A and every minus A has a unifying 0. All opposites are reconciled within the unity of the universe. And this has been going on for 2,500 years. Universalism isn't something I just invented. I've drawn together the strands of the Eastern thinking, which I went to and studied and went to Zen and did, as part of my mystic way for 30 years. And I've done the hard work. And I left off writing until the end of the mystic way, when you have unitive vision, instinctive unitive vision. And so when you get like that, you do not get ruled by differences. You go for the unity behind the differences. And that's what I would like to do in this situation. Yes, there are differences from the point of view of the UN. Can we get behind? And can we somehow get them to see that there is a unity beneath? That's my question.
Yeah. No, it's a brilliant proposal, Nicholas. I certainly would support that. I'm the coordinator for the World Intellectual Forum in Europe. And we would certainly support, an approach to the UN. Do send us a draft of that letter, and let's work on it together. I think it's parallel to another proposal I suggested, which is we set up a think tank on global good governance, which is another way of describing the kind of working group, and work with other organizations, that have different models, different approaches to global good governance. I'm not a supporter of world government, itself, unless it's good world government. What I don't want is a world dictatorship, sort of Putin.
No, we don't want that at all. Not that at all.
We have to have the word global good governance in there, in my opinion.
It's at the supranational level and not the international level. That's fine.
Yeah.
But the way the UN has catered for it in its working group is at the international level, not at a level that would replace it. And
let's do the Don Quixote thing. I admire your spirit, Nicholas. You're a living Don Quixote. Well, so are we all on this forum. Let's come together and charge at the windmill of chaos, militarism, and greed and corruption, and let's take this thing down. Marko, you have a question, sir.
Thank you. First, I support the establishment of the working group as proposed, and I also agree with the federalistic proposal, which is gradualistic. I do not think that any other way towards global government is realistic in times when dozens of nations fight for their liberty and independence. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So the trend on the planet is independency of nations that live under dictatorships. Now, what you see behind me, to be in real world, what you see behind me is the Central Asylum Seekers Center in Slovenia, with a lot of Ukrainians now in it. That's on the way to my home, so that we have a touch with reality.
Absolutely.
In this hyper-connected world. So I support the idea of gradual federalistic approach, and I absolutely like the idea of supranational governance being formed out of as an evolution of UN. I have a question now for you. My beloved writer Victor Hugo said in 849 at one peace conference that nothing but a supranational multi-state body will come out of the wars of that time between Prussia and France, and that's what was realistic. He was the one who announced United Nations in the middle of 19th century, but it needed 100 years, 1 century, to form UN. So what do you think? What's your dynamic view on the evolution with hyper-connected world? What would be a realistic trajectory towards such thing as a supranational evolution of UN into operational, effective government? What would be your thought on the trajectory?
Well, I hope within a decade or two, one's got to be realistic that we've got a war in Ukraine, which is caused by nationalism, and we've got to convince everybody, and I think everybody's already convinced actually, that the war is not a good idea, and we've got to set up a scheme for disarming and preventing future Ukraines from happening. So, but realistically, getting from where we are to getting to a total federal world in one jump is unrealistic. I totally agree. And I've proposed a partly federal structure in between, because if we can evolve by step in stages towards it, then that would be the correct way. The trouble is, I'm 83. I may not look 83, but if I say, oh, I'll be there in 20 years' time to see it through, and I want to go to the UN and speak to the representatives in the General Assembly, and I would gladly go in a year or two's time, or whenever. I mean, now, and give a talk in conjunction with you, Thomas, or in conjunction with Glenn Martin. Perhaps they're here, the three of us, do our presentation to get the working group going. And in the letter, the draft I'll do for you, I'll suggest that a way forward would be that the WIF might have its own working party first, but we're doing that anyway, we hope, but we're trying the UN to work in parallel so that the WIF can feed into the UNs. So those of us who are over 80, and I know there are one or two others there, although they don't look it, can see that things are beginning realistically while they're still able to do things.
Right.
I mean, I was asked, yes, I mean, over to you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Nicholas. That is a good incentive to get this thing moving. I think there's definitely an agreement in this group. We can discuss the details at the business meeting tomorrow. There's a 2-hour slot. Swami Nathan has been taken ill, as you know, so I'll be chairing that.
Sorry,
and we
very sorry.
Details. Can I suggest that we let our next speaker, Rosalba Nattero, speak, because she has a deadline to meet. And then we have at 4 o'clock a professor from Oxford University coming on, who's going to address the whole question of the Ukraine war, the geopolitics, and so on. So we have a hard break at 4. I want to give time for Rosalba's very important contribution, which is following on from a lot of what's been talked about. Rosalba is a druidess from northern Italy, and has been active for a concept of a World Eco-Spirituality Day, among many other things. So Rosalba, please speak to us from Turin, I believe is where you are, yeah?
Yes, I speak
The
from...
floor is yours.
Yes. My statement is about war's world order, comparison between the majority society and the eco-spirituality society of natural peoples, means indigenous people. Sorry for my bad English, and I have a colleague here that at the occasion can help us, Marko Petrillo. Thank you.
Greetings.
Yeah,
can I just give the title, Rosalba, before you start? We've been talking about grand ideas and world systems, but Rosalba's going to talk to us about whose world order, question mark,
Whose
comparison
world?
between the
Yes.
majority society and eco-spirituality of natural indigenous peoples. You know,
Exactly.
if we're building a huge world system, what about the indigenous people around the planet? So Rosalba, do please share your thoughts.
Yes. If it's too long, please, Thomas, stop me.
Have half, go for it. Well, 25 minutes.
Okay, today we live in a world full of conflicts. The war in Ukraine is just one of many wars. At the moment, there are at least 59 in the world. The void of values of the majority society increases this situation, and no peace situations are expected on the planet. The societies of natural people, those indigenous people who have preserved their traditions and have not allowed themselves to be assimilated by the great historical religions, do not have any impact on the planetary situation because they have been relegated into historical pockets that count for nothing. Yet they would have a lot to teach. We can give some example. Viking society, which is usually considered to consist of crude and uncultured warriors, had a parliament called the Assembly of Free Men, in which all citizens participated. In this assembly, the most important decisions affecting the community were made in a form of direct democracy. Women voted and fought with equal men, as evidenced by the discovery in Scotland of the remains of a female warrior. Viking tombs remains containing canine bones have been found in Iceland, suggesting that they cared and respected their animals. Even the gorset of ancient Druidism reflects this principle. After all, the Celts and Vikings came from the same culture. We have a similarity in the Gaia Nashagowa, the great law of peace of the Iroquois Confederation, which still represents the oldest constitution in the world and is a model for modern democracy. It is common belief that the modern Western democracies derive more or less directly from ancient Greece, in particular the Athens of the classical era, and from the Republic of Ancient Rome. However, by modern standards, these societies could not way be defined as democratic. The majority of the population had no decision-making power, and many were not even considered citizen, which meant having no rights. Women were little more than property of their husband. Children were property, and slavery was common practice. However, the Gaia Nashagowa had a great influence on the Western Constitution. In 1988, the United States Congress passed Resolution 331, which recognizes the contribution made by Iroquois Confederacy and other Indian nations in the formation and the development of the United States. Benjamin Franklin, in particular, had a proven relationship with representatives of the Confederation. Gaia Nashagowa had its origins in myth. The legend tells of an ancient time, we would even speak of thousands of years ago, in which the Iroquois nation were at war. A man called Peacemaker wanted to spread peace and united, and on his journey, he met a Mohican leader. And the two left together to spread their message of peace and united from village to village. Thus, it was that the Iroquois nation buried their weapons and under the tree of peace, a symbol of the great law of peace. The Gaia Nashagowa is a supranational constitution. It brings together in a federation different nations which, although belonging the same people, have significant difference, including language. For the Iroquois, the great law of peace represents much more than a simple code of laws. It is the fulcrum of their cultural life, the basis of the social and personal identity of the people, and a compendium of both moral and spiritual principles. There is no difference between law, language, culture, spirituality, and sociality. It is all part of the same identity. Gaia Nashagowa mission is to make a contribution to a better world based on peace, freedom, and knowledge. It is the concept of eco-spirituality, that is a philosophy of life based on the awareness that man is not the center of the universe. He cannot dispose of the planetary and all living beings as if he were the absolute ruler. What binds these nations and what also binds them to all other native nations is the reference to Mother Earth, seen as the only true mother from whom to learn and grow. Mother Earth is not only seen as our planet we owe respect to, but also as the custodian of a great mystical secret. Just as all his children must be respected, whatever species they belong to. These principles are also found in Razna, the constitution of ancient Druidic shamanism. Election and decision take place in the form of direct democracy between all members of community, in which all participate without difference of gender or social class. Unfortunately, these highly evolved societies were erased from history by colonization. It all began with a papal bull of 1452, the Discovery Doctrine, an official act issued by Pope Nicholas V, which allowed Portugal to colonize lands in Africa. Later, in 1493, Pope Alexander VI extended this official act of conquest also to Spain after the arrival of Christopher Columbus in the New World, in order that he could colonize the land across the Atlantic without problems. The principle established by the Discovery Doctrine, also known as Doctrine of Discovery, decreed the formalization of any possible oppression on the land that European conquerors seized on every continent of the planet, in which they came to kill, plunder, and enslave defenseless population. By divine right, in fact, it was lawful for them to take possession of the uncovered lands with all that was on them, including the inhabitants, to do whatever they wanted with them. Of course, as was the case in Europe, there were populations who, in the secret of their more traditional institutions, resisted to the devastating fury of the invaders. These ancient traditions were preserved by the shamans, and still today they are alive and vital, progressing. According to the cliché, it is true that Europeans were responsible for the colonization. In reality, the preparations were done in Europe in the 1200 year with the extermination of the Cathars and subsequently of the Templars. This is where the action of the Holy Inquisition started, with all the massacres involved. The indigenous people are very clear about this fact, so much that in the 2012 at the United Nations in New York, a forum was held on this topic, in which it was emphasized that the Discovery Doctrine is the shameful root of humiliation and marginalization that the natives still suffer today. And it has also been pointed out that the church, the church has, the church has never disowned this bull, just as the Inquisition has never been officially abolished. We are still here, despite 500 years of trying to make of us disappear, said a speaker from the Seneca Nation. This has created two contrasting realities, the majority society and the social society of natural people. The majority society designed by the Greek historical religion is based on anthropocentrism, the dominating man with the right to use all creation as it pleased. This exploitation of resources and animals is causing the sixth mass extinction that has as its cause only one species, never happened in the history of humanity, the man. Intensive farming is among the major causes of pollution, deforestation, climate change. We are facing a catastrophe. On the other part, there are the society of natural people, those people who have not been assimilated by the Greek historical religion and who live in contact with nature intended as life reference. We must dispel the cliche according to which is thought that they live like primitives. They are perfectly integrated in the society in which they live, but they keep their rituals, their tradition, and their tribal societies. They are social systems based on eco-spirituality, therefore on contact with Mother Earth and respect for everything around us, including the plant kingdom and animals. These people are present at the United Nations with their clan leaders and their spiritual leaders. Some of the largest UN assemblies are made up of the indigenous people. However, they have no part in the history of mankind because their reality is too far from that of majority society. Natural people, they are defined in this way because of their link with nature, are present in all continents and have very strong bonds in common, a type of spirituality that arises from intangible and mystical values. It was at the United Nations that we got to know them, and bond that unites people is evident, albeit with different custom and language. This is why my association advocates eco-spirituality, a term coined by its founder, Giancarlo Barbadoro, who had sensed its strength, precisely to give an example of society based on moral value that speak of contact with nature. We have promoted a series of initiatives, including the World Eco-Spiritual Day. We talk about it to United Nations and to Italian Parliament, and now the request is proceeding. We believe that eco-spirituality is a medicine to cure the ill of this planet that seem to have gone mad. There is a need to rediscover contact with Mother Earth, our only true mother. Just there is a need to rediscover our true roots and our true history. Perhaps is precisely in the historical pocket of natural people, those people who are forgotten by the majority society, that we can find the answer to the initial question, was world order? Thank you.
Well, Rosalba, thank you for that brilliant talk. And, you know, you spoke on behalf of many million people around the world. I've coined a new word last night, thinking about everything, indigeneity. It's like negritude. It's the state of being an indigenous person, indigeneity. And I was reading last night Professor Norman Davies' work, who's just joined us and is the next speaker. He gives a brilliant chapter on his trip to Tasmania and the decimation of the Tasmanian indigenous people. You know, there's so much to learn around the world. We need to rewrite the history books and put the indigenous people back in. They hold a timeless picture, as it were. And I'm so glad you've been part of this Druid work we've been doing together. Norman Davies is himself of Welsh origin, so he can be sharing, no doubt, on all this, although he's going to be talking mainly about Ukraine. Any questions to Rosalba before we go to Professor Davies? Marko, you have a hand up.
Yeah, so I think that Rosalba's contribution goes directly in complementarity what was discussed before. Eco-spirituality locally, based on traditional knowledge, must be a part of a process of any supranational building, any supranational structure. We must work in both directions, towards proximity and habitats of communities and towards supranational. Otherwise, it won't work. Otherwise, we will not get decentralized communities equally in the game, in the structure. So both ways simultaneously. Otherwise, it won't work.
Thank you.
I think Rosalba's contribution is brilliant into entering this need.
Thank you, Marko. Thank you, Marko.
Yeah, so the Stalinist model won't work. In the old days, Stalin and his types, or Mao, thought you could improve society by moving populations here and there, you know, unifying their lifestyle, abolishing spirituality, abolishing all difference. Are you saying, Marko, that that was the wrong route? I mean, Rosalba, I'm hearing that we need to, you know, affirm the local intelligence of people, their right to live with the land that they've grown up in, and the knowledge of plants and the animals, and indeed the spiritual world, like the Amazonian rainforest and so on.
Unfortunately,
cutting it down in the name of.
Unfortunately, Stalin did not build on precious tradition of Russian anarchists like Kropotkin, Bakunin, and others, who were building ideas on local communities and self-sufficiency of local communities. Unfortunately,
Yeah,
Stalin did not read those.
No, and Tolstoy, I would say, rather than Bakunin, might have been the better model. Bakunin was quite fierce, actually. Ian, you have a question for us? Comment.
Thomas, you've got us all video muted. I like to be able to see everyone's faces and get a reaction. Sorry. Can you unmute us, please?
Yeah.
The message is host has disabled participants screen sharing. So all I'm saying is, would you disable that? Get us all back.
Sorry, I don't know what happened there, but just make your point, Ian, if you don't mind, because we're.
That's it. I want to just get us all back on screen.
Yeah, I don't know how to do that, Ian. Could you make your point orally, please, and then we can address that.
No, sufficient. I don't want to make a point now, except to get us all visible. Somehow or other, you've shut us all out. It says host has disabled video sharing.
Do you have a point you want to make, Ian, apart from that point?
No, not at this point.
Right. Okay, thank you. Well, I think we can see you again now.
Yes.
Right. If no more questions to Rosalba, I'd just like to thank Rosalba for your contribution. A brilliant summary of. And also, I really am impressed. You mentioned Deganawida and the Iroquois people. I just want to correct the time span. Deganawida lived in about 1100 AD. In my little book of peace declarations, I gave the great law of peace that he transmitted. It was transmitted by wampum beads down to current generations. And if anyone's interested, they can find the text of it in my book. But thank you so much for your contribution. Now I'd like to turn to our next speaker, who's our guest speaker for the day.
Thank you, Thomas.
Professor Norman Davies is one of Britain's leading intellectuals grappling with world history, the history of war, the history of Eastern Europe in particular. And he was a professor at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies, where I did my history degree back in the 80s. You know, it was sad that I wasn't able to do all the courses I wanted. I did courses in world history and political philosophy and Russian history, Balkan history. I didn't do Polish history, so it's my bitter regret that I never managed to go to Norman's lecture. But he's with us today, and he's written 3 very seminal books. The first is God's Playground, which is a history of Poland, which is the definitive work in English, I would say. He wrote a very important book on Europe, a History, which is 1,000 pages of brilliantly argued analysis, looking at Europe not just through the lens of Western Europe, you know, the traditional Britain, France, and Germany, but shifting the center of focus to take in Byzantium, East Europe, Poland, Kiev, Russia, the whole thing, Ukraine. And then he's also written The Isles, in which he does the same for the British Isles. He looks at Ireland, Wales, Scotland, all the different shires that made up England. And again, challenges this notion that there's one history, the dominant elites in a society can dominate and say, this is what history is. Go away and learn about Norman castles and Henry VIII, which is still the history curriculum in England. No, it's ridiculous. We should be studying all the history of the Isles, and Norman's book should be on the curriculum of every sixth form history course, in my opinion. And most recently, he's written an autobiography of his work as a historian called Under Another Sky, which I, again, strongly recommend to colleagues. It's a study of, you know, why history is contemporary. For instance, he goes to Baku and learns about the Armenia-Azerbaijani conflict on the ground with a trip to Baku. And I got to the point where he's gone to Tasmania and he learns about the local peoples and so on. It's a brilliant survey. So Norman Davies, we're honored to have you with us, sir. And we look forward to your talk today. Can you please explain the Ukraine war and put it in the context of East European history? What on earth is going on and what can we do to stop it? Over to you, sir. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Kind words. Can you hear me?
Yes, fine. Yeah.
Good. Well, good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for mentioning Tasmania and Wales, which are both close to my heart. I was originally asked to talk about peace in Ukraine, which is a particularly difficult task when one is faced with what seems to me one of the most blatant examples of a war of aggression in recent times. Everyone wants peace, on condition, of course, that peace comes on acceptable terms. Imperialists, let's not beat about the bush, imperialists, the advocates of empire, are particularly keen on peace so that they can exploit their empire in stable and unruffled conditions. Imperialists only avoid peace, go for war, when one of their colonies or subject peoples is making a break for freedom. And then, of course, they become very aggressive. I realize that many people in the audience, although I can't see you all, are in India, another country for which I bear very warm feelings. I write about it in the book just mentioned, Beneath the Sky, the Another Sky. So I think that talk of empires and colonies, and in our own time, decolonization, provides an excellent route into understanding the unfamiliar affairs of Eastern Europe. I also realize that for sound geopolitical reasons, the name of Russia does not strike the same note of fear in India that it evokes in Eastern Europe. For India, Russia has been a welcome counterweight to other powerful neighbors. And in particular in Soviet times, the apparently anti-imperialist ideology emanating from Moscow, together with the seductive talk of social justice, has been the talk of overtones of social justice naturally proved quite attractive for many caring and thoughtful Indians. So my task today is to convince you, if I can, of some of the realities of Eastern Europe, as opposed to the appearances and the well-known illusions. To this end, instead of listening to me, I would recommend listening to a Ukrainian or Ukrainians. And one of the first things they would tell you is that I am not a Russian. They are not Russians. And yet the world has been told for at least 200 years that the Ukrainians and Russians are inseparable brothers. Quite a lot of Russians speak the same, quite a lot of Ukrainians speak the Russian language. The president of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky, is a Russian speaker, and yet, of course, is the person who's leading resistance against Putin's war. To explain this phenomenon, I must have recourse to the idea of the inner cores of empires as opposed to the outer ring of far-flung colonies. Ukraine formed part of Moscow's inner core, just as Ireland formed a part of England's inner core, inner sphere. Many Ukrainians now speak the imperial language, Russian, without being Russians, just as most Irish people speak English without being Englanders. In fact, the Irish have resisted English and British rule like no one else. Nowadays, there's a strong tendency to blame Vladimir Putin personally for all the trouble. This is very common among Western political scientists who tend to know little history. I'm not out to excuse Vladimir Putin in any way, but it's essential to understand that he is giving expression to very long Russian traditions of imperialism and oppression. Going back right to the 15th and 16th centuries, In fact, Putin seems to have jumped, he's reverted far beyond, far further back than Soviet times. He's not quoting Marx and Lenin. He's quoting Ivan the Terrible, 16th century tyrant, and the doctrine of Third Rome, according to which Moscow was the natural successor to the Byzantine Roman Empire, and according to which all Slavs were expected to obey the Tsar and the Patriarch of Moscow. And the idea that the Ukrainians don't really exist as a people goes right back to Muscovite times. Ivan the Terrible is early 16th century. And for whatever reason, that seems to be the collection of ideas to which Putin is referring. And according to that view, Ukrainians have no right to exist. And Putin has said as much, just as Molotov in 1939 said that Poland doesn't exist. If you don't like a country, some people just try to make it evaporate. It doesn't exist. It's not a real place. And this is one of the extraordinary phenomenon we're faced with at present. Ukraine's struggle for independence is a very long story over many centuries. First against the Poles in the West, Poland being the country immediately to the west of Poland, and against the Russians in the East. I can't go into this great long story. I'll try and mention one or two episodes, but certainly since the mid 17th century, when the Ukrainian Cossacks broke free from Polish rule, there begins a long process of absorbing all the Ukrainian lands, first by the Grand Duchy of Moscow, then by the Empire of Russia, and eventually in 1939 to 40, the last peace by Stalin and the Soviet Union. In that long struggle of Ukrainian independence, parallel, I might say, to Poland's own struggles, there is a long catalogue of defeats, atrocities, setbacks, culminating in 2014 in the so-called Revolution of Dignity. In other words, Ukraine is one of the many countries of Eastern Europe who have a very long history of resisting Russian imperialism and Russian expansionism. I must be brief, but I have a list of things which you can look up if you're interested and learn about this catalogue of Russian aggression against Ukraine. I mentioned the Dnieper Cossacks in the 17th century. They were the first group of people in Ukraine who thought of a separate political existence. They created a so-called hetmanate in the 1650s. And this Cossack entity was gradually overtaken by Moscow and eventually dissolved and absorbed into Russia. There's another very long story of the name of this nation. Going way back, 400, 500 years, there was no nation called Ukrainians. They called themselves Rusins for historical reasons, having descended from the people of Kievan Rus, a medieval state demolished by the Mongols in the 13th century. But when these Rusins who lived in the area of Ukraine, Ukraine being a geographical term for the borders of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, in fact. Ukraine means borderland, frontier, as the Americans would say. When these Rusins of Ukraine came into contact with the Muscovites, they found that the Muscovites, who we know as Russians, the Russians started calling them Little Russians, as though they weren't a separate people with their own language and history. They were presented as if they were simply a lesser branch of the Russian nation. And to oppose this, in the late 18th century, 19th century, a movement began to start calling the nation Ukrainian. It's a geographical name, but it's a name which is adopted in order to distinguish this nation of people from their Russian neighbors. It's very similar, incidentally, to the word the Dutch use to distinguish themselves from their German neighbors, their more powerful German neighbors. Both in the Netherlands, the people call their language and their identity Dutch, Deutsch. But since the Germans call them Deutsch, and in the worst times, the Germans thought the Hollanders were little Germans, the Hollanders started using the geographical name of Netherlands, and they now call their country and their language Netherlands, just as the Ukrainians call their nation geographically Ukrainian, and so on. There's a very long story of religious oppression, something that very few Westerners hear about because it doesn't apply to them. But the Russian Orthodox Church, headed by the Patriarch of Moscow, set out in the 15th century to forcibly convert all the Slavic Orthodox of Eastern Europe, whether they wanted or not, to obey the Tsar and obey the Patriarch of Moscow. Traditionally, the Rusins of Ukraine recognized the Patriarch of Constantinople, the Greek Orthodox Patriarch, going back 1,000 years to Byzantium. But this was something the Muscovites would not accept. The Muscovites treated Slavic Orthodox who did not recognize the Patriarch of Moscow as heretics. And they were not just persecuted, they were killed for it. This is another long tradition in Moscow of maltreating your own people, as it were, for reasons that Westerners have never heard of. To move to more modern times, Ukraine was an independent republic between 1917 and 1921. It gained its independence from the Kerensky government in 1917, and it fought bravely for its independence against all comers, against the Poles, against the Russian whites, and above all against the Bolsheviks. But it was the Bolsheviks who came out on top, not through convincing the Ukrainians about anything, but by brute force, by coercing Ukraine to abandon its independence and become the Ukrainian Soviet Republic, Soviet Socialist Republic, which he did in 1921. So Ukrainian independence is not a myth. It's something which really existed, but which was really suppressed in the early 1920s by the Bolsheviks. And then there's a whole long catalogue of Stalinist horrors in which millions of people are killed. Like, we're not talking about minor episodes. The collectivization of agriculture in the Soviet Union is estimated to have killed 17 million people. And a large part of those were Ukrainians, for the simple reason that the Ukraine was the richest and most developed agricultural region of the Russian Empire and also the Soviet Union. The Ukrainians caught it for being prosperous farmers. As you know, Stalin declared all so-called kulaks. That meant a farmer who had more than one agricultural labor working for him as being, you know, the worst exploiters in the book. There were nothing of the sort. But this campaign cost millions of lives. Then you have the Holodomor, the terror famine of 1932 to 33. Stalin found a way of suppressing Ukrainian resistance, both through collectivization, but also by a deliberate political famine. The Stalin secret security forces cut off Ukraine, took all the grain, all the food, and let the population in a huge area starve to death. And this, of course, this is something which was only discovered, the details of it in you know, the 1980s and 90s. All the Stalinist crimes were denied and very often believed in the West, for the simple reason that Stalin had been our ally in the Second World War, and Stalin was seen as Uncle Joe, you know, the ally who could do no evil. It's only relatively recent that we have learned about all this. Then another of Stalin's unpleasant activities, 1939, Stalin is Hitler's partner. He's not a formal ally, but when Hitler's armies are invading Western Poland, Stalin's armies invade Eastern Poland. And the damage which he did in that period is very similar to what's happening in Ukraine today. The devastation of cities, the arrest of huge numbers of people, and I think what I heard you mention, the physical deportation of millions of people, especially Poles from Ukraine, but Ukrainians from Poland and so on. And this is, we're now into living memory. These things are remembered by Ukrainian families to this day. Second World War, another huge topic. But during the war, the Ukrainian nationalist movement, which traditionally had been connected to Germany, was treated by the Russians as collaborators. Anything Ukrainian was collaboration with the fascists and the Nazis. The Russians don't tell you that the biggest collaborationist army was Russian, the army of General Vlasov, 1 million people. And the one Ukrainian division that joined the German side is held up as it were, the standard of Ukrainian fascism. Well, it's a gross exaggeration which you shouldn't fall for. Well, that's again a short summary. I could treat you to much more of that. In recent history, since 1991, Ukraine has formally been an independent state, recognized both by Russia, by the United Nations, and by all its other neighbors. Moreover, 92% of the population of Ukraine voted in a referendum for independence. It's absolutely unambiguous. And one should say, Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, is a Russian-speaking city. It's not just the Ukrainian-speaking peasants who voted for independence. It was, in overwhelming numbers, the Russian-speaking citizens of Ukraine in eastern Ukraine as well. Now, Russia, of course, was not terribly pleased about all of this, but Russia went along with the idea that Ukraine's nuclear weapons should be handed over in return for recognition. But the Russians traditionally have been quite happy with satellite puppet neighbors rather than the more expensive option of conquering large countries and having to rule them yourselves. And Ukraine after 1991 fits, I think, into this category of a chaotic neighbor state, which the Russians could manipulate in the traditional fashions of infiltration through economic and political means. This role of puppet states, again, has a century-long history. Many of the states of Europe, of Eastern Europe, have been Russian puppets at one time or another. But Ukraine joined this company in 1991, and the Russians tolerated it until the Ukrainians began to press for more genuine controls of their own destiny. There have been two major revolutions, if you want to call them. One in 2004, the other in 2014, when the Ukrainians, in the so-called revolution of dignity, threw out the Russian puppet who'd been in charge, Yanukovych, and set course for a sort of genuinely free, democratic and independent country. Russia's response, 2014, was immediate. They declare war on Ukraine. They invade parts which are very close, Crimea, which is part of legally part of Ukraine, which was annexed. They set up these phony people's republics in the Donbass area, and they began to complain that Russian speakers in Ukraine were being persecuted. This, of course, is a very old story that many dictators have used in the past to justify war. Now, Putin's war. Putin's war against Ukraine began more than 8 years ago, 2014. It was very unsuccessful, apart from the seizure of Crimea, which was taken by exactly the same rules that Catherine the Great used in 1783. First of all, declaring Crimea as an independent state, and then, surprise, surprise, the independent Crimea votes for annexation to Russia. It's old as the hills. But apart from that, the Russian army didn't make much headway. Everybody thought the Russian army was one of the great armies of the world, based on their extraordinary performance in the Second World War. But they turned out to be pretty incompetent, and the very small and untrained Ukrainian army put up rather a good job of getting better and better. And this, of course, is the reason why in February of this year, Putin accelerated his invasion in order to have some more real success. And since then, the war has gone very badly for Russia. The first phase in February, March of this year was a total catastrophe. Unbelievable incompetence. The Russians rolled against Kiev, the capital, with soldiers in parade uniforms, thinking that they would simply roll in without resistance and hold a great parade, celebrating Ukraine's welcoming of their Russian liberators. And of course, that never happened. The Russian attack on Kiev was a total fiasco, and they've been forced to abandon that sector. They had a long battle to conquer part of the coastal area, including the city of Mariupol. But again, they have not received their objectives by a long way. They are nowhere near capturing Odessa, which is the key prize. Equally, they've not been able to make their Black Sea fleet tell. As you know, the Ukrainians sunk the lead battleship of the Russian Black Sea fleet. And it's only in the second phase, in the last couple of months, where the Russians have concentrated all their great numbers and heavy equipment on one sector, that they've made very limited advances. They are attempting to capture the district called the Donbass, which has two parts. They've nearly managed to overcome one half of the Donbass in Lugansk, and they've got something like a third of the second district. So they're a long way from winning the Donbass. The Ukrainians are following clever tactics. They're holding their ground as long as possible, inflicting maximum casualties on the Russians, and slowing their advance to a snail pace. Now, people are always asking you about the end game. How's this going to finish? Well, I don't know how it's going to finish. I don't think many people do, but some things are clear, and they were clear from the start. One is that Russia has no hope whatsoever of occupying the whole of Ukraine. Ukraine, by European standards, is a very big country. Like, it's much bigger than Germany. It's much bigger than France. And in 8 years of war, the Russians have got control of about 15% of it, at the cost of huge casualties. They are not going to be able to conquer the whole of Ukraine by any stretch of the imagination. What else is certain is that whatever the military solution, the Russians have lost the trust of the Ukrainian people. For obvious reasons, because of the long history of Russia-Ukrainian relations, there always was a group of people in Ukraine who were quite favorable to Russia for one reason or other. Now, because of this brutal, savage attack, virtually nobody in Ukraine supports Putin. And even if he ends up militarily victorious, it will be an empty victory because he won't have gained the support of anyone in the population. I should perhaps say a word about NATO, because one element, Putin has explained his war by two arguments. One is this spurious historical argument that Ukraine was always part of Russia, and it's a group of Nazis who are trying to break it away, which is preposterous. But the other argument, which is more seductive, is that NATO has been expanding onto Russia's doorstep, and that this is, this represents a severe threat to Russia. Even I think Pope Francis has fallen for this one, and has talked of the expansion of NATO as a factor in the causes of the war. Well, it's total nonsense. No, NATO expanded into Eastern Europe for a very simple reason, that all the countries of Eastern Europe, like Poland, like Hungary, like Romania, like Bulgaria, like the Czech Republic, you name it, all the nations who had been part of the Soviet bloc begged NATO to accept them. All of those countries had suffered this long history of Russian imperialism, and they saw NATO as a protector against potential Russian aggression. And thanks to the Putin's war, they're all very resolved to remain part of NATO. Nobody has done more to strengthen NATO than Vladimir Putin. It's very simple. So how will it end? I say, I don't know. If Putin has his way, peace will not come until Ukraine is safely returned to Russia's fold, until the Ukrainians are put back in their box and stop trying to behave as an independent member of the United Nations. But I very much doubt whether Putin will get his way we're now in a race as to whether Putin's Russia will give up, whether Putin will be removed, or before he can reach his goal of recovering this little part of the Soviet empire, most of which, of course, has long since escaped and will never be recovered. Thank you very much. I would welcome your questions.
Well, Professor Davies, thank you for your summary of, where we've got to. It's a brilliant survey for those that don't know the history of Eastern Europe. Thank you for taking us on that journey. I slept last night. I often dream about ideas, my mind keeps going at night. And I woke up with something this morning because I listened to this NATO is to blame for the invasion of Ukraine argument. And even a couple of people have made that in the course of our meeting today, yesterday and the day before. And I got this download last night, which I woke up with at dawn, that's like blaming the fire brigade for the fire outbreak. I saw the similarity.
Yeah.
See, NATO is really like the last resort. It was invented during the Stalinist era of the Cold War, which I did my PhD on. It wasn't something that was cooked up for fun. It was to save Europe and other nations from the Stalinist model of oppression. It's like the fire brigade. It's an insurance thing. And you rightly said, thank you, that and the Baltic states were part of that. The countries that got out of the Soviet sphere at the collapse of the Soviet system, they wanted to come in and get in. It's like they wanted the fire brigade insurance system. I'm glad you kind of demolished that argument, but it's being used obviously by Putin and his propaganda machine. One thing you didn't touch on, I don't know if you've read the work, The Road to Unfreedom by Timothy Snyder. He talks about, there's been a propaganda war by Putin's GRU in favor of Brexit and in support of Trump. This destabilization of the West and of the European Union has been going on, in Putin's mind. He's an ex-KGB guy. He's been fighting a long game of an intelligence war. And it seems to me, unless one realizes that, you don't really realize where this Ukraine thing has come from. My question to you is, have you read the book? Do you agree with Timothy Snyder's hypothesis? And do you think he would have invaded Ukraine had we not voted for Brexit, thanks to the GRU?
Well, I know Timothy Snyder very well. I haven't caught up with that book, being an old man with too many things to do. But I absolutely agree that if you like, the political infiltration campaign of Putin is one arm of his operation, and it's been going for a long time. So, no, absolutely. Putin has sought to destabilize as many Western countries as possible. He's a child of the Cold War. He grew up, with the Soviet point of view that the Americans were responsible for all evils in the world. Which is, as you know, only partly true, not completely untrue, but that's his mindset, and he's been trying to get his own back, especially in the new technological world of cyber warfare and clandestine fake news and all the rest of it. I have to say, one area in which the Russians have always been superb is propaganda, and especially when Russia has been in a bad fix, they have produced, the most refined and effective propaganda machine in the world. And they still continue to convince many people. What I'm quite puzzled about, and I'm saying this because I've forgotten what your question was, but
I mean, I was talking about exactly this issue of the power of Putin's propaganda machine. So
yeah, it seems to me that Putin's propaganda machine has made a bad mistake by maintaining that the Nazis are running Ukraine.
yeah,
the slogan is denazification. Well, there are very few Nazis in Ukraine, and the president of Ukraine happens to be Jewish, and of course that's the last group of people who are going to be attracted to Nazi ideas. So this is not a subtle example of Russian propaganda. I think it's a bad sort of extreme line, which is going to be his downfall. They're not going to find any Nazis in Ukraine, just as we didn't find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And the whole argument that they have put forward is going to collapse, and sooner or later the Russian population will learn of that fact and draw conclusions. But generally speaking, the Russians are very clever. They are masters. Like we crudely say, talk of fake news and lying and so on. If you have that standard, the Russians have always lied. Like they're the masters of maskirovka or deception.
right.
And they have completely different standards of, what is acceptable. They have a lovely phrase, vranyo, which means, the aggressive lie, that if somebody says something you don't like, you put out a statement against whatever they said. It doesn't matter whether it's true or not. It's just you say the strongest thing possible to put down the opponent's arguments. So it is very difficult to argue with Russians, at least the dedicated political Russians. They live in their own world, and they have their own standards, and they have their own terminology, and they're quite good at it. You have to admit it.
Well, I mean, before Gevorg, I just want to comment. Thank you for that response. We've been talking in this forum about world order, how we can build a world through truth, what kind of world constitution, lots of visionary ideas. The problem is, I don't see how we're going to get there unless the basic moral fabric of human beings can be reactivated. I mean, Russians were great intellectuals. I studied Russian philosophy at CEAS. I set up a philosophy club. We used to have lectures there. And, the greatest Russian intellectuals are people of great honor and vision. Seems to me Putin has fallen into the hands of Ivan Ilyin and these white Russian neo-fascists. He's gone to the bottom of the barrel and betrayed the Russian intellectual tradition. We have a couple of Russians on our World Intellectual Forum, but they're silenced. They're not here today. They daren't come and speak out.
Well, I would say that Putin hasn't had recourse to Russian fascists. Of course, there are Russian fascists. What he's turned to is the Russian Orthodox Church. He's had himself baptized, and the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church has been blessing the troops who invade Ukraine. And that it's this sort of antiquated Tsarist Russian nationalism which seems to have attracted him. He's not particularly motivated by KGB ideals. he's reverted to whatever his grandfather or great grandfather might have believed. I
Okay.
think it's not that his first name is Vladimir, and that Vladimir was in the Russian narrative a Russian saint of the 10th century who converted Russia to Christianity. Well, Russia didn't exist in the 10th century. Russia was the creation of the Duchy of Moscow and the Russian Empire. 1725, the Peter the Great, another of Vladimir Putin's heroes. But the Russians have created this elaborate fake history whereby their dominance goes all the way back to the 10th century, the beginnings of Christianity. And that is the sort of false narrative which Putin is putting out in the 21st century. It's amazing.
Yeah, it is unbelievable. Okay, we have a question from our Armenian coordinator, Gevork Manukian, who I'm not betraying any state secrets by saying he worked in the Soviet army as a young lad. When Armenia was part of the USSR, like all good boys from Armenia, he had to go to a military academy in Petersburg. So he'll have an interesting take on what you've been saying, Professor Davies. Gevork, the floor is yours.
Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Davies. When you talked about statements, such statements about that Ukraine doesn't exist or Poland doesn't exist by Molotov, etc. I remember that just recently, another dictator, president of Azerbaijan, he said periodically that Nagorno-Karabakh doesn't exist. In 2020, together with Turkey, they invaded and occupied about 70% of the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh Republic, which is an unrecognized country. And now they say that it doesn't exist. And even they changed their legislation and changed the geographical name of Nagorno-Karabakh and refused to cooperate with OSCE Minsk group about the Nagorno-Karabakh problem. So what would you, how would you assess such this today's phenomena? Thank you.
Well, thank you. I've never been to Nagorno-Karabakh because, of course, they won't let people like me go there. If you go to Azerbaijan, you can't go to Nagorno-Karabakh, but it's before the recent times. But it strikes me that Azerbaijani statement that Nagorno-Karabakh doesn't exist is in the same category as Putin saying that Ukraine doesn't exist. If you have no positive solution for a problem or a dispute, in frustration, you say, well, it doesn't exist. It's not there. We're just going to change the names of everything, pretend it isn't there. And I know that the dispute in Nagorno-Karabakh, which of course is a Russian name, which has survived, I'm sure the Armenians call it something else. And the Azerbaijanis will have their own name for it. But it's a good example of if you can't, if you don't have a solution, let's say it doesn't exist. Incidentally, I wrote an article in 1987 when the war broke out between Armenia and Azerbaijan in Nagorno-Karabakh, which was something, according to Soviet rule, shouldn't have happened. Two Soviet republics are fraternal brothers, right? So a war between Armenia and Azerbaijan it doesn't exist. But it did. And I remember saying this is ominous, because if two Soviet republics can start fighting each other, there are 15 republics in the Soviet Union, and this is going to spread. From the Soviet point of view, and we're already in Gorbachev's time, Gorbachev ought to have intervened with full military might and squashed it. I know it's brutal. Not that I suggested that from his point of view, that's what he should have done. But he let it carry on, and it's still going. But I've talked to friends in Estonia, right? In the Baltic states, they noticed that the Armenians and Azerbaijanis were trying to settle their problems in their own way, without reference to Moscow. And lo and behold, within 2 years, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were declaring their independence. And they broke away, those Baltic countries broke away from the Soviet Union before the Soviet Union collapsed. Ukraine became independent after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. But the Baltic states, I think Lithuania was a member of the United Nations before the Soviet Union collapsed. And it's, in a way, it all started in Nagorno-Karabakh. I'm afraid I don't have my own solution for that dispute. I know that it's very complicated, but the worst approach is to say it doesn't exist. It's just nihilism. It's just the refusal to think about the problems.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Davies. We, as the World Intellectual Forum, did issue a declaration, which Gevork and I wrote, on the Nagorno-Karabakh or Artsakh problem. I'll send you a copy of that declaration, and you can share it with friends in Oxford and London. We also issued a similar declaration on Ukraine, which again, I think you might be interested to read. We have a Ukrainian philosopher, Larissa Kadachevtseva, as part of our World Intellectual Forum. She's not been well, so she wasn't able to join our discussion, but she's come to previous ones. I suppose my last question to you, and we'll finish maybe in 5 minutes, is as a historian, you know, I'm a historian as well, but I'm also a philosopher, because I came to the view that mere history alone can't solve the problems, because history can be manipulated, as we're seeing, and it can be controlled by people with access to the media. I mean, most people in Russia fed the lies on Russian television, you know, think that their boys are doing a good job. And so dictatorships create history as they go along, as happened under the Nazi era. We historians come along later, but we can only get the truth, you know, decades later. You're right in saying the Holodomor was only discovered in the 80s and 90s. And even now it's disputed. If we went to a Russian university and wanted a seminar on the Holodomor, we'd be arrested. So history is always a combat zone. For us intellectuals, it's a combat zone. I always maintain we need therefore a bit of the magical dust of philosophy as well, to focus on the question of, you know, what is truth. I don't think people should be allowed to study history unless they also do philosophy. Would you agree? I mean, I was surprised there wasn't a chair in East European philosophy at CEAS, which is why I set up my little philosophy club and got involved with running Philosophers for Peace. You know, it's shouldn't there be a chair in the philosophy of East European and Russian thought, because it's so rich? Polish intellectuals, Ukrainian, Russian, surely they have something to contribute to us.
Well, that goes back to the School of Slavonic Studies, fond memories, as you know. I know you, one of my good friends was Laszlo Péter, who I think was one of your...
Yeah, he was my tutor in political philosophy.
As your tutor, yeah. Well, he was something of a philosopher king, wasn't he? But sure, ideas are crucial. Historians need to be familiar with ideas, familiar with the ways they're manipulated, but very conscious also about language. Language is one of the instruments of manipulation, and it's something that historians need to master themselves in order to be clear and not to fall into specious interpretations. One of the things to finish on, I'm very aware that East European affairs, and in particular East European culture, which would include the philosophical thinkers you mentioned, is one of the black holes of Western academia. Practically every university in Great Britain has a Slavic department where Russian ideas are put forward, where the Russian version of history, which I've been arguing against, is propagated, given to students every day, even at present, and where all the areas of Eastern Europe, which you're interested in, which I am interested in, are bypassed. For example, in Oxford, you can only learn Polish if you can only learn Polish as a subsidiary of Russian. The idea is that these countries, whether it's Poland or Armenia, Georgia, Ukraine, any of the countries, it's as though they're not worth studying. There's no chair of Polish studies. And Poland is the largest of these countries. Well, now, sorry, Ukraine is now the largest of these European independent countries, followed by Poland. They're not tiny little, funny places. They have long history. That Georgia and Armenia have the longest history of any European nation, and nobody tells us about it. So yes, there are almost as many black holes as there are subjects to be discovered, and what we do about it, I don't know. I do my best, but there's not enough of us.
Well, thank you. I hope they give you a knighthood soon, because you've single-handedly been keeping this alive on the British intellectual.
Well, I think my Welsh roots might object to a knighthood, but yes, well, some form of recognition is always received, but I belonged, as it were, to the minority of sort of unconventional historians who not only say unconventional things, but talk about subjects which nobody else bothers to research.
No, thank you very much for your contribution. I think we have one last question from Ireland, another marginalized country. Sean English is our coordinator in Ireland. Sean.
Oh, thanks very much, Thomas, and thanks very much, Professor Davies, for that historical analysis. It's kind of a statement. There is a war going on in Europe at the moment, and that war could expand very quickly. It's a very worrying time. And I think a lot of the analysis that I've been reading would confirm what you're saying, but there is a major issue of downplaying the role of NATO in this. Now, given the historical background of the Russian interference in other countries, but you said something like the Ukrainians sunk the Russian battle flagship. They didn't. The Americans who sunk it.
Sorry?
It was the Americans who sunk that ship. And you see how critical this could go, this conflict could go. And I'm just wondering, what solution do you see, if there's any kind of immediate solution before it spreads much further than where it is now at the moment? That's my question.
Well, I'm not certain I accept all you said, but it's quite true that the risks of this war spreading are obvious. The latest development has been with Lithuania. Lithuania carrying out EU sanctions on the border with the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad, which the Russians are now threatening retaliation, but Lithuania is a NATO member, and if the Russians try to do to Lithuania what they've done to Ukraine, they'll be facing a nuclear alliance. They won't do it, but nonetheless, it is extremely worrying, and how you pour cold water on this, I just don't know. Everything that people do seems to add fuel to the flames. But there's absolutely no doubt as to the origin of the war. It's not a war that was provoked. It was a war that grew out of this strange ideology that Putin's accepted. Archaic history still having its role in the world.
One of our speakers earlier, you missed him, but you can watch him later. Professor B.M. Jain has written a book called Geopsychology. He's linked geopolitics with psychology, and he's arguing we need to study the psychology of leaders like Putin and the others, and somehow find it's almost like a medical problem. I think Putin has psychological problems, grandeur, megalomania, paranoia. It's all there. But how do we get therapy to people that are in power? It's the same with Hitler. I think you probably know that a British intelligence operation once came close to arresting Hitler and putting him in a psychiatric hospital. And we had agents on the ground of the airport in Germany he was about to land on, but he had a funny intuition and landed at a different airport. I heard a BBC documentary about this ages ago.
I knew the British had a sniper in position in Berlin before the war, I think in 1938. Who offered to kill Hitler, who he saw on the balcony down the street, and the British, is either the British ambassador or the British consul said, no, old boy, it's not cricket.
That was probably Sir Eric Phipps, who was the British ambassador.
Yeah.
And his son worked with me. We created Philosophers of Peace.
Very good. Okay.
So,
very good.
I think we've got to stick to the rules of cricket, but we've also got to deliver therapy to these people.
That's true. That's true. Absolutely, yes.
Anyway, look, I'm going to finish there. We've reached our time limit. I want to thank Professor Davies for ending our talk. Gulab Kathari, who was supposed to be our final speaker, seems to have dropped off, but I'll try and record his talk separately. Thank you for joining us, Professor Davies, and everyone else, Sean, Sam, Marko, everyone who's spoken in this panel. I think we've had a very good discussion today. Let's go forward and try and solve this. And I will send an invite by Zoom to board members and also European board members of the World Intellectual Forum. And we can meet online, and although Swami Nathan is in hospital, he won't join us. We can still have a good discussion. So thank you for all your work, Professor Davies. Keep writing those books is all I can say.
What time do we meet tomorrow?
The same time, 6 o'clock India time till 8 o'clock.
Okay.
It's a 2-hour meeting. I'll send everyone who's a board member the Zoom invite again. Okay.
Good, many thanks then. Yes. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.